The plate is lying on its side when it first appears in the quarry wall. Only the edge is visible, a thin arc of dark bone emerging from pale sandstone, but even that narrow line is enough to stop the excavation. Brushes replace picks. Loose grains are lifted away. The curve widens, then rises, until the stone begins to reveal something shaped less like a rib or a limb than a shield. It is taller than the chest of the person uncovering it. Its surface is rough, crossed by channels that once carried blood, and for roughly 150 million years it has rested where floodwater buried it. Somewhere nearby, still hidden in the rock, there may be a tail spike, a vertebra, or the small skull of the animal that carried it. A single plate is immediately recognizable, even before the rest of the skeleton is found. Few extinct animals announce themselves with a structure so strange. Along the back of Stegosaurus stood 2 rows of bony plates, rising from the neck, growing enormous above the hips, then shrinking again toward the tail. Behind them waited 4 long spikes. The head was low and narrow. The hind legs were much longer than the forelimbs. The back climbed steeply toward the pelvis, and the tail extended behind as a muscular counterweight and a weapon. Put together, these parts formed one of the most familiar silhouettes in natural history. But familiarity can disguise how little about this animal is simple. Stegosaurus lived during the late Jurassic, mainly in what is now the western United States, with closely related material also known from Portugal. Its fossils are especially associated with the Morrison Formation, a vast sequence of river, floodplain, lake, and soil deposits laid down between roughly 156 and 147 million years ago. This was the same broad world inhabited by Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, Camarasaurus, Allosaurus, Ceratosaurus, and many smaller animals that rarely receive equal attention. Stegosaurus was not the largest herbivore in these ecosystems. Even a big adult was dwarfed by the longest sauropods. It was not the fastest, and its jaws were not built for crushing thick trunks. Its success depended on a different combination of low feeding, heavy limbs, conspicuous armor, and a tail that made approaching from behind dangerous. To stand beside a living Stegosaurus would be to notice the body before the plates. The torso was deep and broad, supported by 4 limbs that did not match each other in length. The front legs were short and robust, the rear legs taller and more powerful. The neck carried the head close to the ground, usually well below the level of the hips. Depending on the species and the individual, the animal could reach approximately 6 to 9 meters in length. Mass estimates vary because complete adults are rare and different methods reconstruct soft tissue in different ways. But Stegosaurus was a multi-ton animal, comparable not to a lizard enlarged beyond reason, but to a rhinoceros built according to an entirely different plan. If plated dinosaurs are what brought you to Jurassical, subscribing keeps the next journey through deep time close. The plates themselves were not extensions of the vertebrae. They were osteoderms, bones that formed within the skin, like the smaller armor pieces of crocodilians and the heavier armor of ankylosaurs. In Stegosaurus, they became enormous, thin from side to side, and arranged vertically. Because they were embedded in skin rather than locked directly to the spine, they could separate from the skeleton after death. Floods rolled carcasses, scavengers pulled bodies apart, soft tissue decayed, and the plates drifted away from the vertebral column that once supported them. This is one reason early reconstructions were so uncertain. Paleontologists could recognize the bones, but understanding exactly where they belonged required unusually complete skeletons and careful attention to the position in which each fossil was found. The name Stegosaurus means roof lizard. Othniel Charles Marsh chose it in 1877, when the first remains from Colorado were still incomplete and the anatomy was badly misunderstood. Marsh imagined the broad bones lying flat across the back like overlapping roof tiles. Later discoveries showed that the plates stood upright, but even then, their arrangement remained unsettled. They were placed in a single row, paired in two symmetrical rows, and sometimes restored like pieces of armor pressed tightly together. The alternating pattern now seen in most modern reconstructions emerged gradually from better specimens. It is a reminder that a museum skeleton is not simply found. It is assembled from evidence, and every pose contains a history of earlier mistakes. Seen from the side, the largest plates could rise more than a meter above the back. They added little protection to the flanks, where a predator would most easily bite. Their edges were thin. Their internal structure was crossed by vascular channels. In life, bone would have been covered by skin and other soft tissues, giving the plates a surface that no fossil preserves directly. They may have looked dull and leathery. They may have carried patterns. They may have changed appearance as blood flow increased. The fossil record can show the architecture, the growth, and the damage sustained by bone, but the living surface has disappeared. Every restoration must stop at the boundary between what remains and what can only be inferred. That uncertainty has produced several explanations for the plates. They have been described as defensive armor, as structures for controlling body temperature, as displays used to recognize members of the same species, and as signals related to maturity, courtship, or competition. None of these possibilities needs to exclude all the others. Biological structures often serve more than one purpose. An elephant's ear can release heat, communicate mood, and make the animal appear larger. A deer's antler can function in display and combat. Stegosaurus plates may also have carried several roles at once, with their importance changing as the animal grew. The challenge is to separate what is mechanically possible from what the fossils actually support. The tail spikes are less ambiguous. 4 of them projected from the end of the tail in Stegosaurus, 2 pairs aimed outward and backward. Each consisted of a bony core that was probably covered by a keratinous sheath, making the living point longer and sharper than the fossil alone. The tail leading to them was flexible and muscular. A predator approaching the hindquarters faced not a passive row of ornaments, but a weapon capable of moving through a wide arc. Computer models of related stegosaurs suggest that such tails could generate powerful strikes, and damaged predator bones from the Morrison Formation show that close encounters sometimes ended with injuries deep enough to reach bone. One Allosaurus vertebra has a puncture wound often compared with the shape of a Stegosaurus tail spike. The bone shows evidence of survival and healing around the injury. It does not preserve the attack itself, and no fossil can identify the exact movement that caused the wound, but the match is difficult to ignore. Somewhere on a late Jurassic floodplain, a large carnivore may have approached too closely. The Stegosaurus turned its body, planted its feet, and swung. The encounter lasted seconds. The injury remained in the predator for the rest of its life, then entered the rock record as a small piece of evidence that the spikes were more than decoration. Popular culture calls this arrangement the thagomizer, a name invented as a joke in a Gary Larson cartoon, and later adopted informally by paleontologists and museums. The word is modern and humorous. The structure was not. For Stegosaurus, the tail represented the difference between being a slow herbivore and being a slow herbivore that could control the space behind it. Speed was not the only way to survive among large theropods. Armor, posture, awareness, and the threat of injury could make an attack too costly. Predators do not need to believe that prey is impossible to kill. They only need to decide that another meal is safer. The Morrison Formation was not one uniform habitat stretching unchanged across the continent. It covered an enormous area and accumulated over millions of years. Some regions were crossed by broad rivers, others held seasonal ponds, dry floodplains, wooded channels, fern-covered clearings, and alkaline lakes. Rainfall varied through time and place. Long dry seasons were common in many reconstructions, interrupted by storms that filled channels and spread sediment across low ground. The vegetation included conifers, cycads, bennettalians, ginkgos, ferns, and horsetails. There was no grass, and flowering plants had not yet become part of these communities. Stegosaurus fed in a world green with unfamiliar leaves. Imagine the animal moving along the edge of a shallow channel at first light. The front feet press broad, short-toed impressions into damp sediment. The hind feet follow with larger, three-toed tracks. The head sweeps low among ferns and young shoots. Each bite removes a small cluster of leaves. Behind the jaws, the body provides room for a long digestive tract where microbes can break down plant material that the teeth only partly process. The plates catch the low sun, not necessarily glowing or flushing with color, but rising high enough to make the animal visible through open woodland. A juvenile follows at a distance, smaller, lower, and possibly carrying plates that have not yet reached adult proportions. Stegosaurus belonged to Stegosauria, the plated branch of the armored dinosaurs. Together with ankylosaurs and several earlier forms, stegosaurs were members of Theriophora, a name meaning shield-bearers. The earliest theriophorans were smaller and more lightly armored than Stegosaurus. Over time, their skin bones became more specialized. One branch produced the low, broad ankylosaurs, many covered in dense mosaics of armor, and some ending in tail clubs. The other produced stegosaurs, in which armor was reorganized into plates and spikes that emphasized the midline of the body and the tail. These were not stages on a ladder. They were separate experiments built from a shared armored ancestry. The exact family tree continues to change as new fossils are described and old specimens are re-examined. Early stegosaurs from China preserve combinations of features not seen in later forms. Some had relatively small plates and prominent shoulder spikes. Others carried more spikes than plates. Derived stegosaurs, such as Stegosaurus, developed a distinctive arrangement with very large dorsal plates and a compact set of terminal tail spikes. The broad pattern is clear even when individual branches remain debated. Stegosaurs appeared by the Middle Jurassic, spread across several continents, reached their greatest diversity during the Jurassic, and survived in reduced numbers into the early Cretaceous. Their history lasted tens of millions of years. A human lifetime could pass more than 2 million times between the earliest known stegosaurs and the extinction of the last representatives of the group. During that span, oceans opened, coastlines shifted, mountain ranges eroded, and populations became isolated on opposite sides of growing seas. Stegosaurs lived in what are now China, Europe, North America, Africa, and possibly other regions represented by fragmentary remains. They crossed landscapes that no longer exist and left behind a record often made not of complete skeletons, but of isolated plates, broken spikes, teeth, footprints, and partial bones scattered through ancient sediment. Stegosaurus is the most famous of them because its skeleton combines exaggeration with balance. The head is almost absurdly small beside the pelvis. The forequarters are low, the hindquarters elevated. The plates create height without much mass, while the tail carries weight and danger behind the body. Yet the animal was not a collection of odd parts. Every feature belonged to a working organism that had to breathe, feed, grow, avoid injury, find others of its kind, and move through changing seasons. The real question is not why Stegosaurus looked strange to us. It is how that shape functioned so effectively in its own world. Fossils answer that question slowly. A plate sectioned under a microscope reveals growth lines and blood vessels. A worn tooth shows how the jaws moved. A trackway preserves the spacing of steps. A tail vertebra defines the range of motion between neighboring bones. A quarry map records which plates lay to the left or right of the body. None of these clues is dramatic by itself. Together they allow a living animal to emerge from stone, not perfectly and not permanently, but with enough detail to replace the old image of a dim, sluggish reptile with something more precise. The reconstruction begins with the skeleton. Stegosaurus had a skull long and low, ending in a beak that cropped vegetation. Small teeth lined the rear portions of the jaws. The neck was made of short vertebrae and could not reach high into the canopy. The shoulder girdle was powerful, supporting much of the front body while leaving the hind limbs to carry a greater share of the weight. The pelvis was enormous, not because it housed a second brain, as an old myth once claimed, but because large muscles and internal organs required space and attachment. The tail began thick at the hips and narrowed gradually toward the spikes. That second brain story grew from an enlarged canal in the sacral region of the spinal column. Similar spaces occur in birds and other dinosaurs, where they may hold glycogen bodies or other tissues associated with the nervous system rather than a separate center of thought. Stegosaurus did have a small brain relative to its body, but brain size alone does not describe behavior. Many living reptiles and birds perform complex tasks with brains that would seem modest beside those of mammals. The fossil skull can estimate shape and volume. It cannot measure attention, memory, recognition, or the practical intelligence required to navigate a Jurassic landscape. For most of the day, Stegosaurus may have done nothing that would look dramatic. It walked. It fed. It rested in shade when heat built over the floodplain. It followed water during dry periods and moved away when channels overflowed. It carried parasites, healed from minor injuries, replaced worn teeth, and responded to sounds and scents around it. The plates did not need to flare in every encounter. The tail did not need to strike every predator. Survival is usually made from ordinary hours, repeated until they become a life. The fossils preserve the exceptional moments because those are the moments that damage bone. The animal itself was shaped by everything between them. Late Jurassic ecosystems placed constant pressure on a herbivore of this size. Allosaurus was common across much of the Morrison Formation and could grow larger than Stegosaurus. Ceratosaurus, Torvosaurus, and other theropods added different hunting styles and body sizes. Juveniles were especially vulnerable. An adult with a complete set of tail spikes presented a serious risk, but a young animal could not rely on size or fully developed weapons. Growth therefore changed the balance between danger and defense. Understanding Stegosaurus means following that transformation, from a small hatchling with uncertain armor to an adult whose outline could stop a predator before the first bite. The story of the plated dinosaurs begins before that adult silhouette existed, in smaller armored animals that carried rows of simple osteoderms along their backs. It moves through Middle Jurassic China, where some of the earliest true stegosaurs appear. It crosses African floodplains with Kentrosaurus, European islands and coastal plains with Dacentrurus and Miragaia, and the seasonal river systems of North America with Stegosaurus and Hesperosaurus. Each animal altered the same basic equipment. Plates became taller, shorter, narrower, or replaced by spikes. Necks lengthened, shoulder armor expanded, tails changed in flexibility and reach. The familiar form was only one answer among many. But the best place to understand that answer is the quarry wall, where the plate still lies half inside the rock. Its shape is already visible. Its function is not. The excavation will recover bone, position, and association. Microscopes will reveal tissue. Computer models will test movement. Comparisons with other stegosaurs will place it in an evolutionary pattern. Even then, the living surface, the color, and the exact moment when the plate mattered most will remain beyond reach. Paleontology advances by accepting that boundary, then moving as close to it as the evidence allows. The Morrison Formation preserves Stegosaurus so well because it was built by sediment. Rivers shifted across wide basins east of rising mountains. During floods, water escaped its channels and spread sand, silt, and mud across the plain. A carcass stranded near a bank might be opened by scavengers, broken apart by currents, and buried in stages. Bones exposed too long cracked under the sun. Others were carried downstream, sorted by size, or deposited against fallen trees. Complete skeletons are rare because complete burial is rare. Every quarry therefore records two histories at once, the life of the animal and the physical events that moved its remains after death. A Stegosaurus found with plates near the body offers information that an isolated plate cannot. The orientation of the bones can suggest how the carcass settled. Articulated vertebrae show that ligaments still held parts together when burial occurred. Teeth scattered near the skull may have fallen from their sockets during decay. Fine sediment inside the brain case can preserve internal shapes. Even the absence of a bone matters, though it must be interpreted cautiously. Missing plates might have been removed by erosion, carried away before burial, destroyed during excavation, or never fully developed in a juvenile. Fossils do not arrive as clean answers. They arrive as patterns that can support several explanations until more evidence narrows the possibilities. The landscape around a living Stegosaurus would have changed over a single year. In wetter months, channels expanded and low areas held standing water. Horsetails crowded muddy margins. Ferns spread through disturbed ground where floods had cleared older vegetation. Conifers stood on better drained soils, while cycads and Bennettitalians occupied open patches. In the dry season, ponds shrank, plants toughened, and animals concentrated near reliable water. A large herbivore could not wait for ideal food to return. It had to move through a mosaic of feeding areas, taking what the season offered and relying on its digestive system to extract energy from fibrous leaves and stems. Stegosaurus probably spent much of its time feeding close to the ground. Its skull was narrow, its neck short, and its forelimbs kept the front of the body low. Ferns, young conifer growth, cycads, horsetails, and low branches all fall within the likely feeding envelope, though direct evidence for exact plant preferences is limited. The jaws did not grind food with the complex chewing motion of later ornithischians such as hadrosaurs. Teeth met plant material, cut or crushed it, and passed it into a large gut. There, fermentation could continue for hours or days, assisted by microbes that no fossil preserves, but that would have been essential to the animal's survival. Bite force studies complicate the old picture of Stegosaurus as a weak feeder. Digital models suggest that its jaws could generate forces within the broad range of some living herbivorous mammals and could probably handle more than soft fern fronds alone. Small branches were not automatically beyond its ability. The teeth were still modest, and the animal was not stripping thick bark or cracking woody trunks, but it may have used a wider diet than early reconstructions allowed. This matters because the Morrison was seasonal. A herbivore able to crop both soft growth and tougher material would be less vulnerable when preferred plants became scarce. Feeding height also affected competition. Sauropods could reach vegetation far above the ground, but many also fed at low and middle levels. Small ornithopods cropped close to the surface. Other armored dinosaurs occupied overlapping spaces. No ecosystem supports large herbivores by giving each species a perfectly separate menu. Instead, differences in body size, jaw mechanics, movement, gut capacity, and preferred habitat reduce competition enough for several animals to coexist. Stegosaurus may have concentrated on plants that were abundant near the ground and along disturbed floodplains, using its beak and simple teeth to harvest quickly, while its broad body carried the digestive volume needed to process poor quality food. The sound of such feeding would be ordinary. Beak against stem. Leaves pulled free. The slow shift of weight from one forefoot to the other. Air moving through the nostrils of a skull held less than a meter above the ground. Insects would rise from vegetation, though there were no bees visiting flowers and no grasshoppers living in grasslands as we know them. Small mammals remained mostly hidden. Lizards, crocodiliforms, turtles, and amphibians used the margins of water. Above them, pterosaurs crossed open sky. Birds in the modern sense were only beginning to emerge from feathered theropod ancestry elsewhere in the Jurassic world. The largest animals in view would be sauropods. A Camarasaurus could raise its head far above Stegosaurus. Diplodocus extended through the woodland like a moving bridge of muscle, neck, and tail. Their presence changes the scale of every scene, but it should not make Stegosaurus seem small. A multi-ton animal with plates higher than a person's head remained a major part of the landscape. Its lower profile simply occupied a different layer of the ecosystem. Where sauropods altered branches and canopies, Stegosaurus disturbed the understory, trampled paths, opened patches of soil, and redistributed plant material through feeding and digestion. Predators read this landscape through movement. An Allosaurus did not need to attack every herbivore it encountered. It could test distance, direction, and vulnerability. A healthy adult Stegosaurus facing away might appear exposed, but the tail made the rear the most dangerous approach. The sides offered access to the torso, yet the predator had to pass within range of a lateral swing. The head was less defended, although reaching it meant moving toward the forequarters while avoiding the animal's ability to pivot. A coordinated group of predators might create more options, but evidence for pack hunting in Allosaurus remains debated. Most encounters probably ended without contact. Hunger changes calculation. A wounded predator, a drought, or a juvenile separated from larger animals could shift the balance. The fossil record contains bite marks on dinosaur bones, but identifying the exact circumstances is difficult. Teeth touch carcasses after death as well as prey during attack. A mark on a Stegosaurus bone may record predation, scavenging, or both. The absence of bite marks does not prove safety, because many attacks affect soft tissue and leave no trace on bone. What survives is a biased sample of violent moments, filtered through decay, burial, erosion, and discovery. Trackways provide a different kind of evidence. Bones describe anatomy. Footprints record behavior during a few seconds of life. Stegosaur tracks are generally assigned to forms such as Deltapodus, with broad, three-toed hind footprints and smaller, crescent-shaped impressions from the hands. They show a quadruped moving, with the hands turned in a way consistent with the skeleton. They also reveal stride length, pace, direction, and the softness of the ground. Some track sites preserve several paths with similar orientation, raising the possibility that stegosaurs sometimes move together. The evidence is rare, and parallel tracks do not automatically prove a permanent herd, but they make strict solitude less certain. A 2024 study of track sites in Spain described what may be the strongest footprint evidence yet for gregarious behavior in stegosaurs. At some surfaces, multiple trackways and preferred directions suggest more than isolated animals crossing by chance. Different size classes may be represented, though substrate and foot posture can alter apparent dimensions. The authors were cautious, as they needed to be. A group of tracks could record animals moving together, animals following the same shoreline at different times, or repeated use of a narrow route. Still, footprints preserve possibilities that bones alone cannot. They show that plated dinosaurs were moving through shared spaces, sometimes in patterns that resemble social travel. Consider a tidal flat near the end of the Jurassic in what is now Spain. The mud is firm enough to hold shape, but soft enough to deform under weight. One stegosaur crosses, placing the front foot down as a curved impression and the hind foot behind it. Another path runs beside the first. Smaller tracks occur nearby. A thin layer of sediment covers the surface before waves. Wind, or later animals erase it. No bodies are buried. No bones remain. Yet the paths survive, turning an ordinary movement into one of the only direct records of several stegosaurs occupying the same ground. Social behavior does not need to mean a tightly organized herd. Living large herbivores show a wide range of arrangements. Some remain solitary, except during mating. Some gather seasonally near food or water. Some form loose associations that change from day to day. Others maintain stable groups with juveniles protected among adults. The fossil record may never distinguish all these possibilities for Stegosaurus. A bone bed can mix animals killed years apart. A track site captures minutes, but not relationships. The safest conclusion is that stegosaurs were capable of proximity and may sometimes have traveled or gathered together, while the strength and permanence of those associations remain uncertain. Reproduction is even harder to reconstruct. No nest securely identified as Stegosaurus has provided a complete picture of eggs, incubation, and parental care. As dinosaurs, stegosaurs laid eggs, but the size, shape, nesting material, and arrangement for most species are unknown. A hatchling could not have been a miniature adult in every proportion. Plates and spikes had to grow with the skeleton. Limb proportions changed. The skull and jaws developed. Histological studies of osteoderms show that plates and spikes transformed internally through life, with blood supply, cortical bone, and remodeling patterns shifting as the animal approached maturity. Juvenile Stegosaurus material from Dinosaur National Monument includes limb bones, shoulder elements, parts of the pelvis, ribs, and skull fragments. Plates were not found with that individual, which has encouraged questions about when the large osteoderms appeared. Their absence cannot prove that the juvenile lacked plates. The bones may have separated before burial or remain undiscovered. Other young stegosaurs do preserve osteoderms. What can be said is that the full adult display was reached gradually. A young animal's defensive equipment would have been smaller, and the mechanics of its tail would have differed from those of a mature individual carrying long spikes at the end. Growth made the animal more visible and more dangerous. A plate that began as a small element in the skin expanded upward and outward as new bone formed. A spike lengthened, thickened, and changed internal structure. Muscles at the tail base increased in force. The torso deepened, creating more digestive capacity. With every year, the balance of risk changed. A juvenile survived through concealment, association, alertness, or rapid growth. An adult could rely increasingly on size and weaponry. The transition was not marked by a single moment. It was written across seasons of feeding and the slow accumulation of bone. The same growth record helps test ideas about plate function. If plates were primarily defensive, their mechanical strength and timing of development should reflect that role. If they were mainly display structures, rapid enlargement near sexual maturity might be expected. If they contributed to heat exchange, vascular patterns and surface area become important. Histology reveals extensive blood vessels, especially in growing plates, but blood supply alone does not settle the question. Growing bone requires circulation. Tissue maintenance requires circulation. A structure used for display can also be vascular. The evidence supports biological activity, not a single purpose. Thermoregulation was once the dominant explanation. Stegosaurus plates were compared with the ears of elephants or the sails of large reptiles, surfaces that could release or absorb heat. Their alternating arrangement might allow air to move around both sides. Blood flowing through the plates could exchange heat with the environment. Experiments and models showed that such a system was physically possible under certain conditions. Later work noted that internal vascular architecture varied among stegosaurs, and that large plates might not be optimized as simple radiators. The question shifted from whether heat exchange could occur to whether it was important enough to drive the evolution of the structures. Display offers another explanation for their diversity. Different stegosaur species carried different combinations of plates and spikes, often in shapes too distinctive to be explained by simple protection. Stegosaurus had broad, high plates. Kentrosaurus shifted from smaller plates near the shoulders to long spikes along the back and tail. Miragaia combined a long neck with its own pattern of osteoderms. Gigant Spinosaurus carried enormous shoulder spines. Such differences could help animals recognize members of their own species, assess age or condition, and communicate at a distance. Natural selection does not separate survival from communication. Correctly identifying a mate or rival can be as important as surviving a predator. Color is the part we cannot test directly. The plates may have been patterned, banded, spotted, or nearly uniform. Their skin covering may have included keratin that altered texture and shape. Increased blood flow could perhaps have changed brightness, though this remains speculative. Modern reptiles and birds use color in ways that bone never records. A stegosaurus approaching another might have presented a visual signal far more complex than the brown or gray shapes common in older artwork. But responsible reconstruction must keep possibility separate from evidence. We can restore color, Because living animals have color, we cannot claim a specific pattern without preserved pigments or close anatomical clues. Defense and display also overlap. Large plates made the animal appear taller. Seen broadside, they increased the outline presented to a predator or rival. Even if they were too thin to stop a powerful bite, they could make the body harder to judge and the animal more difficult to approach. Damage to a plate might bleed heavily, but the torso below remained protected by distance. The plates could also channel an attacker toward the rear, where the tail was strongest. No single feature needed to work alone. The whole body formed a defensive system: low head, broad torso, elevated hips, visible plates, and a mobile spiked tail. To use that system, Stegosaurus had to turn. Its hind limbs supported a large share of the body mass, and the center of mass lay far back compared with many quadrupeds. The forelimbs were sturdy but shorter. Digital studies of related stegosaurs suggest an erect habitual stance, with the limbs placed beneath the body, while a wider stance may have helped resist sideways forces during defensive tail swings. The exact motion remains modeled rather than observed. Yet the skeleton makes one point clear: this was not an animal designed to sprint away. It was built to remain stable while controlling the area around its body. Speed estimates for extinct animals are uncertain because muscles, tendons, and behavior do not fossilize completely. Limb proportions indicate that Stegosaurus was a walker, not a runner adapted for long chases. That does not mean it moved with constant slowness. Large living animals can accelerate over short distances, pivot quickly, and produce sudden force without reaching high top speeds. A Stegosaurus surprised at close range may have responded faster than its old reputation suggests. The danger lay not in pursuit, but in the first few steps, when the tail moved from resting position into a strike. A failed strike carried risk. Long spikes could break, tail vertebrae and muscles could be injured. A predator might move inside the arc or attack while the weapon was committed in another direction. Defensive behavior is never perfect. It reduces probability. Natural selection favors structures that help often enough to outweigh their cost, not structures that guarantee survival. The plates required energy to grow. The tail required muscle to carry. The spikes complicated movement through dense vegetation. Their persistence across millions of years suggests that those costs were repaid, whether through defense, display, species recognition, thermal biology, or some combination. In the quarry, a broken spike can preserve the result. Some osteoderms show healed damage or altered growth. A fracture surrounded by remodeled bone means the animal lived long enough for repair. Infection may leave roughened surfaces. Wear at a joint can reveal repeated stress. Paleopathology turns an individual fossil into a biography. It shows that dinosaurs were not ideal anatomical diagrams. They carried old injuries, developmental differences, and the consequences of encounters that no longer have witnesses. A Stegosaurus skeleton with a healed wound is evidence not just of violence, but of survival after violence. That personal scale mattered to early fossil hunters less than the race to name species. In the late 19th century, discoveries in the American West reached museums during the rivalry known as the Bone Wars. Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope competed for fossils, publications, and prestige. Field crews worked quickly. Specimens were sometimes described from limited material. Names multiplied before anatomy was fully understood. Stegosaurus emerged from this period, along with many other famous dinosaurs, carrying a taxonomic history shaped by both scientific ambition and the imperfections of the available fossils. Marsh named Stegosaurus armatus from fragmentary remains in 1877. Over the following years, he named additional species as new skeletons and isolated bones arrived from Colorado and Wyoming. Some names were later combined, rejected, or reinterpreted. The species Stegosaurus stenops, named in 1887, is represented by some of the best material and has become the standard image for the genus. Stegosaurus ungulatus is often recognized as another valid species, though the assignment of particular specimens and the status of other names continue to be discussed. Taxonomy changes because new comparisons reveal that variation once treated as separate species may reflect age, individual difference, or incomplete preservation. The original type species, Stegosaurus armatus, was based on material too incomplete to define the genus as securely as later specimens. This created a technical problem. The name Stegosaurus was anchored to a poor specimen, while the much better known S. stenops carried the anatomy used by nearly everyone. In 2013, the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature accepted a proposal making S. stenops the type species. The change did not alter the animal. It stabilized the name around a specimen and species that could actually support detailed comparison. Even iconic dinosaurs depend on such careful administrative work. One of the most important modern specimens is the nearly complete Stegosaurus nicknamed Sophie, discovered in Wyoming in 2003 and later acquired by the Natural History Museum in London. It preserves much of the skeleton, including a remarkable skull and an extensive series of plates and tail spikes. Because the bones are three-dimensional and individually accessible, researchers have scanned them, built digital models, estimated body mass, examined feeding mechanics, and studied growth. Sophie was probably not fully mature and measured about 5.5 meters long. A volumetric model estimated a mass near 1.6 metric tons for that individual, though other methods produced higher values. The disagreement between methods is useful. Limb-bone equations estimate mass from relationships observed in living animals. Volumetric models wrap digital soft tissue around a skeleton and calculate volume. Both require assumptions. A body made too lean underestimates mass. One made too broad adds tissue without evidence. Equations developed from mammals may not perfectly describe an armored dinosaur with unusual proportions. Comparing methods exposes where uncertainty enters. The goal is not to produce a number that looks exact. It is to define a plausible range and understand how body mass affects movement, feeding needs, balance, and the forces a tail could generate. A digital Stegosaurus begins as hundreds of separate surfaces. Each bone is photographed or scanned from many angles. Software turns those images into three-dimensional geometry. Vertebrae are articulated. Ribs are placed around the torso. Limb joints are aligned within realistic ranges of motion. Plates are restored in sequence. Missing pieces are mirrored or estimated from related specimens. Then, muscles and body contours are added. The result can be rotated, measured, and tested in ways impossible with a heavy museum mount. It is still a reconstruction, but one in which every assumption can be changed and its consequences calculated. This is how the animal continues to change without a new bone being found. A different estimate of cartilage alters limb height. A revised plate position changes the outline. New data on muscle attachments shifts the center of mass. Better comparisons with living animals refine joint posture. Museum skeletons once froze a single interpretation in steel and plaster. Digital models allow several versions to exist at once, each tied to explicit choices. The living Stegosaurus remains inaccessible, but the reconstruction becomes more honest about what is known, what is likely, and what is still being tested. The plate in the quarry wall eventually leaves the rock inside a protective jacket of plaster and fabric. In a laboratory, preparators remove sandstone grain by grain until the full bone is exposed. Its base shows where it sat in the skin. Its channels record growth. Its asymmetry helps determine which side of the body it occupied. Alone, it is impressive. Joined to the rest of the skeleton, it becomes evidence of sequence, balance, and identity. The plated dinosaur takes shape not in one discovery, but in the accumulation of details, each small enough to miss and together large enough to rebuild an animal. To understand the plates, it helps to begin with what they were not. They were not scales enlarged into rigid shields, and they were not part of the spine. Each plate developed as bone within the skin. At its base, connective tissue anchored it above the vertebral column. The plate's interior contained cancellous bone, compact outer layers, and channels for blood vessels. Its surface in life was covered, probably by skin and a keratinous layer, though the thickness and texture remain uncertain. That covering could have changed the apparent outline, smoothing rough edges or extending them slightly beyond the fossilized core. The number of plates varies among specimens and reconstructions because complete sequences are unusual. Stegosaurus stenops is commonly restored with about 17 plates, while individual specimens can preserve slightly different counts or incomplete series. The plates did not form identical pairs. Left and right elements differed in size and shape, and the most accepted arrangement places them in two alternating rows. From above, the sequence would have created a staggered pattern rather than a symmetrical fence. This asymmetry made the outline more complex and may have increased visible surface area, but it also makes isolated plates difficult to place when their original position is unknown. Stand behind the animal, and the plates would narrow into overlapping shapes, one rising slightly left, the next slightly right. Move around to the side, and the full profile appears, with the tallest elements above the pelvis. The arrangement changes with perspective. A predator approaching from a distance would see a different signal than another Stegosaurus standing broadside. The plates may have been effective precisely because they transformed the body's outline. They did not hide the animal, they made it unmistakable. Early museum mounts struggled with this geometry. Some placed the plates in two paired rows, creating a neat symmetry that seemed visually reasonable. Others used a single row along the midline because it reduced the need to explain left and right differences. Better articulated specimens showed that neither solution matched the evidence. Alternation also explains how very broad plates could fit without colliding at their bases. The pattern was not perfectly regular, and soft tissue would have influenced spacing. But the two staggered rows now have stronger anatomical support than the older arrangements. The largest plates grew where the back reached its highest point. That location may have maximized visibility. It may also have placed the greatest surface area above a large mass of body tissue where heat exchange could matter. Or it may simply reflect developmental patterning inherited from ancestors whose osteoderms changed gradually along the body. Evolution often modifies an existing sequence rather than designing one from nothing. A small neck plate, a broad pelvic plate, and a narrowing tail plate may be produced by the same developmental system responding differently at each position. Bone histology allows researchers to examine that development. Thin sections taken from plates reveal microscopic organization, vascular canals, growth zones, remodeling, and the transition between more porous internal bone and denser outer tissue. Young plates show active growth. As the animal matures, internal architecture changes and secondary bone replaces earlier tissue. The process is not identical to the growth of a horn core or antler in a living mammal, but comparisons help identify whether the structure grew continuously, remodeled under stress, or reached a mature condition. Histology once seemed to support thermoregulation strongly because the plates were highly vascular. Blood could move through them, and their broad surfaces could exchange heat with air. Yet highly vascular bone is expected in any rapidly growing structure. The crucial question is whether mature plates maintained circulation arranged specifically for heat transfer. Studies of internal vascularity found complex networks, but interpretation remains contested. Some channels may have supplied the covering tissues. Others may reflect growth or repair. The plates could exchange heat without having evolved primarily for that purpose. Thermoregulation would also depend on behavior and environment. A plate can absorb solar energy in direct sun and lose heat in moving air. The direction of benefit changes with temperature, wind, blood flow, body orientation, and the properties of the skin covering. In cool morning conditions, Increased blood circulation might help warm the animal. At midday, the same surface could release heat if air was cooler than the body. During very hot conditions, sunlight could add heat rather than remove it. Any thermal role would have been dynamic, controlled partly by where the animal stood and how blood moved through the tissue. The total surface area was substantial. A line of tall plates running the length of a multi-ton animal created far more exposed tissue than a smooth back would have carried. Even if thermoregulation was secondary, the plates must have affected heat balance. They cast shadows across the body. They altered airflow. They exposed vascular tissue to the environment. Evolution could then refine a structure that began for display or defense and later acquired thermal benefits, or the reverse. Multifunction is not a compromise explanation. It is common in living anatomy. Defense by direct armor is the least convincing role for the large plates. They were too thin to protect the flanks like ankylosaur osteoderms, and their position left much of the body exposed. A strong bite could damage them. However, defense does not require a plate to stop teeth. The structure's increased apparent size complicated an attack path and may have protected the top of the neck and back from downward bites. They also made the animal easy to identify at a distance, reducing the chance that a predator would approach before recognizing the tail weapon attached to the same silhouette. A predator learns. An Allosaurus that survived one strike did not need to understand the anatomy in human terms. It only needed to associate a broad-plated outline with danger behind the hips. Juveniles, inexperienced predators, or desperate individuals might still attack. Others could choose sauropod young, ornithopods, carcasses, or weaker, Stegosaurus. In this way, the plates may have advertised the spikes. The message was not encoded in color or intention alone. It was reinforced by the real cost of getting too close. Display becomes more plausible when the variety of stegosaur osteoderms is compared across species. If protection were the only pressure, similar predators should favor broadly similar armor. Instead, stegosaurs produced an extraordinary range. Some carried tall plates with rounded upper margins. Some had narrow plates and long spines. Kentrosaurus shifted gradually from plates at the front to spikes at the rear. Gigantospinosaurus had huge shoulder spines extending sideways. Dawsontrurus carried robust plates and spikes. Miragaia had an elongated neck and a distinctive pattern still incompletely known. The differences are the kind expected when structures communicate identity as well as provide defense. Species recognition is difficult to prove in fossils. Modern animals do not always need exaggerated structures to recognize their own kind, and similar ornaments can evolve for other reasons. Still, in a landscape where several large herbivores shared feeding areas, a tall plate pattern would be visible over vegetation and across open ground. Shape, movement, posture, sound, and scent could all contribute. The plates may have been one part of a larger recognition system rather than a single visual code. Sexual selection is another possibility. Large ornaments can evolve when mates prefer them, or when rivals use them to assess condition. A plate is expensive to grow and maintain. An individual that develops a complete, undamaged series may advertise health, age, or access to food. Yet proving male and female differences requires a large sample of adults whose variation cannot be explained by species, age, preservation, or individual growth. Stegosaur fossils rarely provide that clean sample. In 2015, a study proposed sexual dimorphism in the Stegosaur Hesperosaurus based on two broad plate shapes found in a quarry assemblage. One morph was wider and more rounded, the other taller and narrower. The authors interpreted the broad form as likely male and the tall form as likely female, arguing that the difference exceeded normal variation. The study drew attention because it offered a rare testable claim about dinosaur sex. It also drew criticism over sample association, taxonomy, age, and whether the plates truly belonged to one species and population. The debate remains a useful example of how paleontology works. A dramatic conclusion is not accepted because it is attractive. Researchers ask whether the specimens came from the same horizon, whether they represent the same species, whether body size and maturity were comparable, and whether deformation changed shape. They test the statistical method and the evolutionary assumptions used to assign sex. Even if dimorphism existed, identifying which morph belonged to males would require additional evidence. The possibility is real. The certainty is not. What the debate reveals most clearly is that plates varied. Some of that variation came from position along the body. Some came from growth. Some may have separated species, populations, sexes, or individuals. A living herd or gathering of stegosaurs would not have looked like repeated copies from a model set. Plate outlines would differ. Old injuries would interrupt edges. Young animals would carry smaller structures. Skin color and condition would add more variation than bone records. The familiar silhouette was a family resemblance, not a uniform. Plate growth may also have changed communication through life. A juvenile with low osteoderms would present a smaller outline and perhaps rely less on display. As maturity approached, rapid plate enlargement could make age visible. Adults might assess one another without physical combat, reducing the need to risk tail spikes. In living animals, ornaments often prevent fights by allowing rivals to compare size or condition. A Stegosaurus did not need to swing its tail at every member of its own species. The plates may have helped settle encounters before weapons were used. But weapons could also be used within the species. Tail spikes suited for defense against predators could injure rivals. Fossils rarely identify the source of trauma. A puncture in a stegosaur bone might come from a predator tooth, another stegosaur's spike, an accident, or post-mortem damage. Living animals frequently repurpose defensive structures in competition. Horns, tusks, antlers, claws, and tail clubs do not obey a single category. If adult stegosaurs competed for mates, space, or access to resources, the tail would have been available. The mechanics of the plates themselves suggest they were not meant to receive repeated heavy impacts. Broad Stegosaurus plates had relatively thin edges and large surfaces. A powerful collision could fracture them. Spikes, by contrast, concentrated force along a narrow point and were strengthened differently. Histological studies show that mature spikes developed dense outer bone suited to resisting bending and impact. Plates and spikes were both osteoderms, but growth shaped them for different mechanical demands. The body carried display surfaces along the back and penetrating weapons at the tail. Keratin probably extended the tail spikes. In living horned and clawed animals, the bony core is shorter and blunter than the external sheath. The exact length cannot be recovered, but the functional point would have been sharper than museum bones suggest. Keratin also changes how force enters tissue. A hard sheath can penetrate skin and muscle while protecting the bone beneath from abrasion. If a sheath broke, it could regrow to some degree, whereas a fracture of the bony core carried greater risk. An impact strong enough to drive a spike into a predator's vertebra would send force back through the spike, tail, pelvis, and feet. The animal had to absorb that reaction without falling. The tail base was thick. Vertebrae supported large muscles and ligaments. Hind limbs stood beneath the body, and a wider stance could increase stability. A strike was not simply a whip of the final vertebrae. It was a whole body action, beginning with the feet and hips, passing through the tail, and ending at the point of the spike. The visible speed may have been sudden. At rest, the tail extended behind the body, held clear of the ground by muscles and connective tissue. During defense, it could move laterally while the animal pivoted to keep the weapon between itself and an attacker. Related stegosaur models show that high tip velocities were possible without treating the tail like a flexible bullwhip. The mass of the distal spikes added momentum. Even a glancing strike could tear tissue. A direct strike at a leg, belly, or chest could end an attack immediately. Computer models are only as reliable as their inputs. Researchers must estimate joint mobility, muscle size, tissue mass, and the behavior chosen by the animal. Too much flexibility creates impossible motion. Too little underestimates reach. A tail reconstructed with oversized muscles may generate unrealistic force. A narrow stance may fail under side loads that a living animal could resist by repositioning its feet. Modeling does not replace fossils. It asks whether a proposed behavior is compatible with anatomy and physics. Kentrosaurus has been particularly useful because enough of its skeleton is known to build detailed digital reconstructions. It was smaller than the largest Stegosaurus, with a series of plates and spikes that became increasingly weapon-like toward the tail. Studies found that the tail could cover a broad defensive zone and that the animal could produce dangerous strikes. The results are often applied cautiously to Stegosaurus because the two genera differed in size and osteoderm arrangement. Still, they show that stegosaur tails were not too stiff, weak, or slow to function as weapons. Tail posture matters. Old reconstructions sometimes let the tail drag, creating a passive line behind the body. Dinosaur trackways generally lack tail marks, and skeletal articulation supports a tail held above the ground. In stegosaurs, this elevated posture was essential. A dragging tail would blunt spikes, restrict movement, and make rapid defense difficult. Muscles at the base maintained the tail's weight, while ligaments reduced the energy needed to hold it continuously. The animal did not have to tense every muscle at full force all day. The anatomy could support the tail economically until stronger contraction was needed. The plates added another challenge to movement through vegetation. A tall series of osteoderms could catch branches or limit passage between closely spaced trunks. This suggests that Stegosaurus favored open woodland, floodplain edges, fern savannas, and other habitats where a broad body could move without constant obstruction. It could still enter forested areas, especially along paths opened by sauropods and other large animals. Jurassic landscapes were not untouched walls of vegetation. Large herbivores created trails, broke branches, and maintained openings through repeated movement. A path used by dinosaurs would accumulate signs: trampled ferns, broken cycads, droppings filled with plant fragments, footprints pressed over older footprints, scratches on low trunks, shed teeth from predators scavenging nearby. The plates of Stegosaurus rose above this disturbance, while its head remained close to the plants being cropped. That contrast between high ornament and low feeding is central to the animal. The most visible part of the body did not gather food or deliver the strongest strike. It communicated presence. Presence can be enough. A modern porcupine often avoids attack because the quills are visible before contact. A skunk signals with pattern and posture. A horned animal turns its head so the weapon can be assessed. Stegosaurus could stand broadside or angle its body to display both plates and tail. We cannot know the exact sequence, but the anatomy would have allowed warning before impact. A predator that ignored the warning met the spikes. The skin between plates is almost unknown. No complete Stegosaurus body outline preserves every soft tissue boundary. Impressions from other dinosaurs show that scales varied in size across the body and that skin could carry folds, pebbled textures, and larger feature scales. Stegosaurs probably had predominantly scaly skin. The bases of the plates needed thick connective tissues and blood supply. The transition from back skin to plate covering may have been smooth rather than sharply separated, making the osteoderms appear as integrated parts of the body rather than bones stuck onto it. Some reconstructions add flexible keratinous coverings that enlarge plate edges. Others keep the covering thin. The fossil cannot currently decide between them. Thick keratin might protect bone and support display coloration, but it would also alter thermal performance. A thin vascular skin would transfer heat more efficiently, but leave the plate more vulnerable. Different regions may have had different coverings. The tail spikes almost certainly needed tougher sheaths than the broad dorsal plates. Treating every osteoderm as if it carried the same tissue oversimplifies a complex system. Chemistry may eventually recover more. Under exceptional conditions, fossil tissues can retain microscopic residues, pigment structures, or molecular fragments. Such preservation has transformed reconstructions of feathers in some dinosaurs. Stegosaur plates have not yet provided comparable color evidence. Most are preserved as mineralized bone after the outer tissues decayed. Until a specimen retains more, color remains an informed artistic choice rather than a scientific result. Even without color, the sequence was visually powerful. The tallest plates rose above the pelvis, where the body's arch reached its maximum. Toward the neck they diminished, keeping the front low. Toward the tail they narrowed and gave way to spikes. The pattern led the eye along the animal, from cropping head to elevated back to armed tail. It looked designed because natural selection can produce coherent forms through the accumulation of small changes. No plan was required. Individuals with structures that improved survival or reproduction left more descendants, and the sequence changed generation by generation. The earliest armored dinosaurs did not possess this arrangement. Small theriophorans, such as Stegosaurus, carried many small osteoderms rather than a few giant plates. Stegosaurus, from the early Jurassic, was larger, quadrupedal, and more heavily armored, with rows of scutes and spikes. It stood near the early diversification of the lineages that would later produce stegosaurs and ankylosaurs. Its armor protected more of the body, but lacked the exaggerated vertical surfaces of Stegosaurus. The plated condition evolved from a broader armored foundation. This transition involved reducing the number of some osteoderms while enlarging others. Instead of a continuous protective mosaic, stegosaurs emphasized a sequence along the neck, back, hips, and tail. The shift may have begun with defense and display acting together. Once individual osteoderms became visible signals, selection could diversify their shapes rapidly. A slight increase in height changed recognition. A longer spine changed defense. Developmental changes that affected position and growth could produce new species-level patterns without rebuilding the entire skeleton. Middle Jurassic China preserves several stages of this experiment. Huayongsaurus had relatively modest plates, prominent spikes near the shoulders, and a body less extremely specialized than Stegosaurus. Bashanasaurus, described from older Middle Jurassic rocks in Chongqing, combined primitive theriophorine traits with features of true stegosaurs. These fossils show that the group was already diversifying by around 168 million years ago. The classic Stegosaurus pattern did not appear suddenly in Western North America. It emerged from a longer Asian and global history of armored herbivores. The sequence of plates therefore carries evolutionary information as well as function. A fossil plate can help identify a genus, but isolated osteoderms are difficult because shape varies along the same individual. A narrow element may come from the neck of a broad-plated species or the back of a more spiny one. Researchers need associated bones, precise quarry data, and comparisons across complete sequences. Naming a new stegosaur from a single plate is risky. The most distinctive structures are also among the easiest to separate from the skeleton after death. Commercial fossil collecting can make that problem worse. A plate displayed without detailed locality, horizon, or association may be visually impressive but scientifically diminished. The rock layer matters. The position of nearby bones matters. A specimen removed without mapping can lose information that no preparation can recover. Plated dinosaurs are especially vulnerable because isolated spikes and plates attract attention. Science depends not only on the object, but on the context that connects it to time, place, and individual. In a museum, the plate stands upright again. Steel supports what skin and connective tissue once held. Light strikes its surface, revealing grooves that visitors may interpret as scars or decoration. Most are simply parts of growth and preservation. The bone has crossed from a living body to a river deposit, from stone to laboratory, and from research collection to public display. Its scale creates wonder, but its deeper value lies in the questions it keeps open. Those questions do not reduce the animal. They make it more real. A fantasy creature needs only a dramatic outline. A living Stegosaurus required blood vessels, developmental signals, tissue repair, heat balance, social responses, stable joints, and enough food to pay for every kilogram of bone. The plates were beautiful because they were biological, not because they escaped biology. Their mystery is not that they had no function. It is that several useful functions may have been layered into the same structure, and the rock preserves only part of the answer. The tail begins at the pelvis, not at the spikes. Close to the body, the vertebrae are large, surrounded by muscle, and connected to a skeleton that must resist every defensive movement. Farther back, the vertebrae become smaller and more numerous. Their joints allow lateral motion while limiting directions that would damage the spinal cord or dislocate the chain. Tendons and ligaments add stiffness where needed and store elastic energy between movements. By the time the tail reaches the final pairs of spikes, a movement initiated near the hips has been translated into speed. The classic Stegosaurus arrangement includes 4 terminal spikes, though older mounts sometimes showed 8. Confusion came from incomplete skeletons and the difficulty of deciding whether isolated spikes belonged to one animal or several. Better specimens established 2 pairs as the usual condition for Stegosaurus stenops. Other stegosaurs carry different numbers and distributions. In Kentrosaurus, the transition from dorsal plates to caudal spines is gradual, making it harder to define a separate terminal set. The convenient word thagomizer fits Stegosaurus best, but the evolutionary reality was a continuum of tail armament. The spikes were not mounted vertically like fence posts. They projected outward from the sides of the tail, positioned to strike during lateral motion. Their bases articulated within soft tissue rather than directly with vertebrae. The exact angle varied among reconstructions and perhaps among species. If aimed too far backward, they would reduce the width of the strike. If aimed too far sideways, they might interfere with movement or vegetation. Associated specimens constrain the most likely orientation, while biomechanics tests whether that arrangement produces effective contact. A defensive sequence may have started with orientation. The animal detects movement through vision, smell, vibration, or sound. It turns so the tail faces the threat. The forefeet step sideways, while the hindquarters remain stable. Plates present a broad profile. The tail begins to sweep. A predator can withdraw, circle, feint, or continue. The Stegosaurus does not need to see directly behind with perfect clarity if it can track motion through head turns and body position. It only needs enough information to keep the spikes between its torso and the attacker. The range of vision is uncertain because soft tissues of the eye are not preserved. Skull shape places the eyes on the sides, providing a broad field rather than the strong forward overlap of a predator. This is useful for detecting movement around the body. Depth perception directly ahead may have been less precise, but the animal was not targeting prey with its jaws. Its defensive weapon operated behind the head, creating a coordination problem unlike that of most living herbivores. Proprioception, the body's awareness of its own position, would have been essential. The nervous system did not need a second brain in the pelvis to control the tail. Spinal circuits can coordinate complex movement without conscious calculation. A horse kicks accurately behind itself. A crocodile sweeps its tail through water. A porcupine raises quills in areas it cannot see directly. Stegosaurus inherited a vertebrate nervous system capable of integrating sensory input, muscle stretch, balance, and learned response. The enlarged space in the sacral canal may have housed a glycogen body or other tissues, but it was not an independent command center for the hindquarters. Endocasts of the brain case suggest a relatively small, elongated brain with modest regions for smell and other senses. The skull was much smaller than the pelvis, which encouraged the misleading idea that the animal was exceptionally unintelligent. Relative brain size does place Stegosaurus below many theropods and later ornithischians, but ecological competence cannot be reduced to a ratio. The animal found food and water, recognized danger, coordinated a large body, reproduced, and navigated social encounters for generations across changing environments. Evolution does not preserve a lineage for tens of millions of years through complete behavioral inadequacy. A Stegosaurus did not need to solve abstract problems. It needed to remember routes, respond to weather, distinguish familiar signals, and choose when to stand, move, feed, or strike. Those tasks can be performed by nervous systems very different from ours. The old caricature of a brainless giant says more about human preference for brain size than it does about the dinosaur. The predators around it were more agile. Allosaurus had powerful hind limbs, a large head, grasping forelimbs, and a tail used for balance. Its skull was built to open widely, with serrated teeth that cut flesh. It could approach from the side, bite, withdraw, and allow blood loss to weaken prey. Whether it hunted alone or sometimes cooperated, it faced a problem with Stegosaurus that did not exist with an unarmed carcass. Every close pass entered the reach of the spikes. The punctured Allosaurus vertebra, often cited as evidence of a tail strike, is compelling, but not a complete case. Shape correspondence supports the idea. Healing proves the predator survived for a time, yet the exact stegosaur species, direction of impact, and behavior are reconstructed. A spike could break during penetration, leaving material in the wound, or withdraw cleanly. The encounter may have been predatory, defensive, or even related to a carcass dispute. Fossils preserve consequences more readily than motives. Other injuries show the cost on both sides. Theropod teeth could fracture or leave grooves in bone. Stegosaur spikes could break. An infection after a deep wound might kill days or weeks later. A predator that escaped immediate death could still lose mobility and starve. A herbivore bitten in the tail or flank could survive if major vessels and organs were spared. Natural selection favored caution because even a successful attack could end the attacker's future. The defensive arc was probably strongest to the sides and rear. Directly in front, the low head and short neck offered fewer weapons. A predator might try to force the animal to turn, distract it, or reach the shoulder. But the hindquarters could pivot, and the tail's reach increased the space a predator had to cross. The uneven limbs may have helped rotation by placing powerful muscles around the pelvis. Stegosaurus was not trapped in a straight line. Its anatomy was specialized for a stable rear-driven body. Forelimb structure shows a columnar hand with short, broad digits arranged to support weight. The hindfoot had 3 main weight-bearing toes. Trackways fit this pattern. The front feet were placed closer to the center line in some reconstructions, while hind feet carried more of the load. Cartilage at joints would have added height and changed angles compared with a dry skeleton. Museum mounts that place bones directly against bones can underestimate the living animal's limb length and produce an overly crouched posture. Stegosaurus walked with limbs held beneath the body, not sprawled like a lizard. Dinosaurs inherited an erect posture that made sustained terrestrial movement more efficient. The elbows may have angled slightly outward, and the forefeet were not pronated like human hands. Their orientation followed the anatomy of the radius, ulna, wrist, and digits. Incorrect hand placement in older reconstructions gave many dinosaurs palms facing backward or flat in ways the joints could not support. A trackway turns static anatomy into rhythm. Front foot. Hind foot. A pause of space, then the pattern repeats. Stride length indicates a steady walk. The tail leaves no drag mark. Pressure deforms the mud more deeply beneath the hind feet, depending on substrate and weight distribution. If the animal changes direction, the inner steps shorten and the outer steps lengthen. A brief slip can preserve a scrape that records correction. The body is gone, but the sequence retains motion. Estimating speed from footprints uses relationships among stride length, hip height, and gait observed in living animals. The result is approximate. Soft mud shortens steps. A deep track may record the foot sinking and pulling free rather than normal motion. Hip height must be estimated from the track maker, which may not be known exactly. Most stegosaur trackways indicate walking speeds, consistent with limb anatomy. There is little reason to imagine a gallop. Rapid defense could come from acceleration of the tail and pivoting rather than whole body running. Energy economy favored steady movement. A multi-ton herbivore feeding on low-quality plants cannot waste calories. Long migrations may have occurred if water or vegetation shifted seasonally, but the Morrison landscape offered many local habitats across river systems. Stegosaurus may have moved between feeding areas rather than crossing continents in continuous herds. The daily range of a living individual is unknown, yet body size and diet suggest hours spent cropping and processing food, interrupted by travel, rest, and vigilance. Resting posture is rarely discussed because it leaves little fossil evidence. The animal could have folded its limbs beneath the body or rested on the sternum and belly, but rising with short forelimbs and tall hind limbs required coordination. Large living quadrupeds often rest less than smaller ones and may sleep in short periods. A Stegosaurus lying down would reduce its ability to swing the tail freely, increasing vulnerability. It may have chosen open ground or the company of others when resting, though this remains inference rather than direct evidence. At night, the plates would become dark shapes against a sky without city light. Temperature dropped over the floodplain. Moisture collected on leaves. Small mammals emerged. Insects moved through litter. A Stegosaurus could remain standing, body heat stored in its mass, or settle where the ground was dry. The tail rested, but did not become useless. A vibration, scent, or sudden movement could bring the hindquarters back into defensive position. Hearing ability can be estimated partly from the inner ear. The shape of the semicircular canals relates to balance and head movement, while the length of the cochlear region offers clues to frequency sensitivity. Stegosaurus data are limited compared with better-studied dinosaurs. Low-frequency sounds and ground-borne vibrations may have been important for large animals, especially where visual contact was blocked by vegetation. Calls could travel across open floodplains, but no fossil preserves the vocal organ clearly enough to reconstruct exact sound. Communication may have combined low calls, body posture, plate presentation, tail position, and scent. A juvenile separated in tall ferns could call to an adult. Rivals could stand broadside. A threatened animal could lower its head and shift the tail. These are plausible behaviors derived from living analogs and anatomy, not scenes directly recorded in stone. The distinction matters, but it does not forbid reconstruction. It requires that speculation remain proportional to evidence. Smell was likely useful for locating water, food, other animals, and carcasses that signaled predators nearby. The nasal passages were not enormous, and the olfactory bulbs appear modest, but even a moderate sense of smell can guide herbivores. Chemical information persists after an animal has passed. Dung, urine, crushed vegetation, and disturbed soil create trails invisible to fossils. A Stegosaurus experienced a landscape layered with such information. The mouth began with a beak. Keratin covered the front of the jaws, producing a cropping edge sharper than the underlying bone. Behind it, rows of small teeth processed vegetation. Stegosaurus teeth had triangular crowns with small denticles along the margins. They were replaced through life, though not at the extreme rates known in some sauropods. Wear facets show contact and movement between upper and lower teeth, indicating more oral processing than a simple bite and swallow model once suggested. Digital studies comparing Stegosaurus with other herbivorous dinosaurs found that its bite was stronger than expected for its small skull. Estimated forces varied by tooth position and muscle assumptions, but they were sufficient for a range of plant tissues. The jaw system balanced a narrow head with muscles anchored behind the orbit and along the lower jaw. It was not built for chewing like a cow. Instead, repeated bites cropped and crushed material before the gut completed digestion. A narrow muzzle can be selective. It allows an herbivore to choose particular shoots rather than taking a broad swath. Stegosaurus may have targeted young growth with higher nutritional value. especially when available. During dry periods, selectivity becomes harder as preferred plants decline. The animal could then broaden its diet to tougher foliage and small twigs. Tooth wear, bite force, and beak shape support flexibility within a low-browsing niche. The digestive chamber behind that small head was probably enormous. Fermentation produces gas and heat. A broad torso allows long retention times, giving microbes more opportunity to break cellulose and other structural compounds. Large body size improves digestive efficiency because food can remain in the gut longer without preventing continuous intake. This is one reason giant herbivores can survive on vegetation that would not sustain a small animal at the same relative rate. Gastroliths, or stomach stones, are sometimes invoked for dinosaurs with simple teeth, but evidence that Stegosaurus deliberately used a gastric mill is limited. Stones found near skeletons may be ordinary sediment, and living herbivorous reptiles can ferment plant material without relying on large quantities of swallowed rock. The safest reconstruction gives microbial digestion the central role while leaving occasional stone ingestion possible. A compelling idea is not the same as a demonstrated organ. Food quality in the Jurassic has also been reconsidered. Conifers and cycads are often described as uniformly poor forage, yet experiments using modern relatives show that some Mesozoic plants could provide useful energy after fermentation. Ferns and horsetails vary widely. Horsetails can be abrasive because they contain silica, but they can also be nutritious. The Morrison offered not one diet, but a seasonal menu of leaves, shoots, stems, cones, and low branches. Cycads contain toxins in living species. This does not prove Stegosaurus avoided them. Large herbivores can tolerate compounds through gut microbes, selective feeding, or liver metabolism, and ancient cycads may not match modern chemistry. Fossil association alone cannot identify diet. A plant and dinosaur found in the same formation may have lived kilometers or thousands of years apart. Direct evidence would require preserved gut contents, coprolites securely linked to the animal, or characteristic microscopic wear. For Stegosaurus, such evidence remains sparse. The feeding scene therefore stays broad. The beak closes around a cluster of fern fronds. Teeth press through stems. The head withdraws and moves sideways. A few pieces fall. The animal steps forward. It does this again, then again, hundreds or thousands of times. The plates remain above the work, visible but uninvolved. The tail follows behind, ready but still. Most of the anatomy that makes Stegosaurus famous is quiet, while the anatomy that keeps it alive repeats a simple task. Could Stegosaurus rear onto its hind legs to reach higher vegetation? Its powerful hindquarters and rearward center of mass have encouraged the idea. Some biomechanical studies of Kentrosaurus suggest a tripod posture using the hind legs and tail was possible. Stegosaurus had a different build, and the spikes complicate using the tail as a ground support. Brief rearing may have expanded feeding height or display, but habitual high browsing would conflict with the low skull and short neck. The possibility should be treated as occasional rather than central. A tail used as a prop would also place stress on vertebrae and risk damaging spikes if contact occurred too far back. The animal might brace on the robust tail base while keeping the terminal weapon elevated, but the exact posture is uncertain. Fossil trackways do not preserve rearing directly. Feeding traces at height are difficult to assign. The idea remains biomechanically interesting, not established behavior. The center of mass lay near the hips because the pelvis, hind limbs, and tail carried so much tissue. This reduced the load on the forelimbs compared with many quadrupeds. It also made the animal responsive to rear-driven movements. A slight shift of the torso changed pressure beneath the front feet. The hind limbs could provide much of the force for acceleration and turning. The tail balanced the front half and acted as a rotating mass during defense. Rotation creates momentum that must be stopped. After a strike, muscles on the opposite side slow the tail before it overextends. The feet adjust. The body may pivot back. Repeated swings would be tiring, especially if performed at maximum force. Warning movements were cheaper. A partial sweep, a turn, or a lifted tail could communicate readiness. Full impact was likely reserved for moments when deterrence failed. Predators may have targeted tired or injured individuals precisely because defense had limits. A Stegosaurus with arthritis in the hips, a damaged tail, or a broken spike would be easier to approach. Drought reduces strength. Infection slows reaction. Age wears joints. Fossil assemblages contain animals at different stages of health, and predators select among them. The dramatic contest between perfect adults is less common in nature than an attack on vulnerability. Bone surfaces can reveal some of that vulnerability. Arthritic growth changes joint margins. Fused vertebrae show chronic stress or injury. Uneven muscle attachment can reflect compensation. A spike with a healed fracture records time after damage. These pathologies make population ecology visible. They show that Stegosaurus individuals lived long enough to accumulate wear, and that some survived conditions that altered movement. Longevity is estimated from growth lines in bones, but the record is incomplete. Like tree rings, lines of arrested growth can reflect seasonal slowing, though not every year leaves a clear mark and remodeling may erase early lines. Large dinosaurs often reached substantial size rapidly, then continued slower growth. Stegosaurus probably took years to mature, not centuries, and growth rate would vary with food, climate, and health. The plates may have continued changing after body length approached adult size. Rapid juvenile growth would reduce the period of greatest vulnerability. Eggs limit hatchling size because shell strength and gas exchange constrain how large a dinosaur egg can become. Even the offspring of giant dinosaurs began small relative to adults. A young stegosaur therefore faced a dangerous gap between hatching and effective defense. Faster growth, hiding, group association, or parental attendance could help bridge it. Which strategies Stegosaurus used remains one of the largest missing parts of its biology. A juvenile footprint is more intimate than an adult skeleton. The impression may be only a fraction of the size, but the pattern is already stegosaurian: broad hindfoot, small hand, quadrupedal gait. It crossed mud under its own power. Whether an adult walked beside it may be lost if the larger tracks were eroded or made on firmer ground. The young animal leaves one line of movement, then disappears from the record. Survival into adulthood transformed the odds. The body became heavier, the tail stronger, the plates more imposing. Few predators could attack without risk. An adult Stegosaurus may still have died from drought, disease, accident, or predation, but it was no longer easy prey. Its armor did not cover every surface because complete coverage was unnecessary. The defensive system only had to make the animal costly enough that most predators looked elsewhere. That cost shaped predator behavior across generations. Allosaurus and Stegosaurus shared the Morrison for millions of years. Each lineage evolved within the presence of the other, though not in a simple one-to-one arms race. Predators hunted many prey species. Stegosaurs faced several predators and competed with other herbivores. Still, repeated interaction favored better detection, stronger strikes, more cautious approaches, and perhaps changes in social behavior. Ecosystems are networks of such pressures, none acting alone. The Morrison record also changes through time. Species distributions differ between lower and upper layers. Climate and river systems shifted. Stegosaurus fossils are more common in some intervals and regions than others. A reconstruction that combines every Morrison animal in one scene may place species together that were separated by millions of years or hundreds of kilometers. The formation is a library, not a single photograph. This matters when describing direct encounters. Stegosaurus stenops and a particular Allosaurus specimen may come from broadly similar ages, but exact overlap requires stratigraphic context. Paleontology often speaks at the formation level because that is where data are strongest. A scientifically cautious scene uses animals known from compatible intervals and acknowledges that the fossil record blends time. The goal is not to remove imagination, but to keep it anchored. On one floodplain, the anchor may be a tail spike found beside several vertebrae. On another, it is a trackway crossing ripple-marked mud. Elsewhere, a plate lies alone in channel sand, transported far from the carcass. Each fossil creates a different view. Together they describe a herbivore that could feed quietly for hours and become violently dangerous in a second. The old image of Stegosaurus as a slow, foolish animal waiting to be attacked survives because its body looks unbalanced to modern eyes. The head seems too small, the back too high, the plates too extravagant. But natural selection did not need to make the animal familiar. It made a stable walker, an efficient low browser, a visual signal, and a rear-facing weapons platform. The shape was not a mistake corrected by later dinosaurs. It was a successful solution that spread across continents and endured long enough to become one of the defining forms of the Jurassic. The plated dinosaurs did not begin with plates. Their ancestry reaches back to small ornithischian dinosaurs, whose armor consisted of scattered bony elements in the skin. Stegosaurus, from the early Jurassic of what is now Arizona, was lightly built, about the size of a large dog, and probably capable of moving on two legs. Hundreds of small osteoderms ran along its body. They offered limited protection, but they established the developmental ability to grow bone within the skin. From that modest beginning, Thyreophorine evolution produced some of the most heavily ornamented land animals ever known. Armor carries cost. Bone is metabolically expensive to grow. Added mass affects movement. A rigid covering can reduce flexibility, and a prominent spike can catch vegetation or break during a fall. Early armor must therefore have provided enough benefit to persist. Even small osteoderms can make a bite less effective, protect blood vessels near the surface, or signal maturity. Once the genetic and developmental system existed, selection could enlarge particular elements while reducing others. The result was not an immediate tank, but a series of experiments. Stegosaurus shows a later stage. It lived during the early Jurassic, in what is now England, close to coastlines where carcasses could be washed into marine sediments and preserved. It was several meters long, quadrupedal, and carried rows of scutes and spikes along the body. The skull, limbs, and armor are known from unusually complete material. For many years it was treated as a vague relative near the base of both stegosaurs and ankylosaurs. Detailed redescription has clarified its anatomy, though its exact position within early Thyreophorine relationships continues to be discussed. Stegosaurus lacked the tall, alternating plates of Stegosaurus and the dense body armor of later ankylosaurs. Its osteoderms formed a more continuous protective system. This intermediate appearance is useful, but it should not be called a direct ancestor. Fossil species are usually side branches that share features with the true ancestral population. Stegosaurus shows the kind of armored dinosaur living near the time when major Thyreophorine lineages were separating. It is a reference point, not a missing link arranged neatly between two later groups. The split between stegosaurs and ankylosaurs is estimated from anatomy and evolutionary trees, but the earliest record is incomplete. Both groups appear clearly by the Middle Jurassic. New discoveries have pushed specialized ankylosaurs and stegosaurs farther back in time than once expected. This suggests that important diversification occurred during intervals and in regions where terrestrial fossils are still rare. The absence of a skeleton from a particular age does not mean the lineage did not exist. It may mean the right sediment was never deposited, preserved, exposed, or searched. Middle Jurassic China has become one of the most important windows into that early radiation. The Sichuan Basin and nearby regions preserve river and lake deposits filled with dinosaurs that lived while the continents were still arranged in a world very different from the late Jurassic Morrison. Sauropods, theropods, early ornithopods, and armored dinosaurs shared humid lowlands crossed by channels. Volcanic activity and rapid burial helped preserve bones. Some quarries contain several stegosaur species, showing that plated dinosaurs were already diverse long before Stegosaurus appeared. Bashanosaurus primitivus comes from the lower member of the Shaximiao Formation near Chongqing and dates to around 168 million years ago, though geological ages always carry margins of uncertainty. Described from several individuals, it combines traits seen in early theriophorans with features characteristic of stegosaurs. The best-known individual was about 3 meters long and may not have been fully grown. Its anatomy places it among the earliest known stegosaurs, possibly near the base of the group's family tree. Bashanosaurus did not look like a reduced stegosaurus. Its plates were lower and thicker, and parts of the skeleton retained more primitive proportions. The shoulder region carried a large spine, the tail possessed defensive elements, but the full arrangement is incomplete. Such a mosaic is expected early in irradiation. Different parts of the body change at different rates. The lineage had already committed to a plated and spiked system, but the extreme high-backed silhouette of later forms had not yet evolved. Imagine the animal at the edge of a Middle Jurassic channel. It is shorter than the famous North American genus and less elevated over the hips. Low plates rise through the skin. A shoulder spike extends from the side. Its head moves among ferns and seed plants, while larger sauropods feed beyond the trees. The form is recognizable as a stegosaur, but only after we know what came later. To the predators around it, this was not a primitive draft. It was a living herbivore, equipped for its own time. Huayangosaurus taibai, also from the Middle Jurassic of Sichuan, is known from skull and postcranial material that reveal another early combination. Its skull was broader and deeper than that of Stegosaurus. Small horn-like projections appeared near the back of the head. The limbs were more similar in length, giving the back a less steep rise toward the pelvis. Plates ran along the body, accompanied by spikes that included prominent elements near the shoulders and tail. Huayangosaurus is often placed outside Stegosauridae, the more derived family containing Stegosaurus and many close relatives. That position reflects retained ancestral features rather than inferiority. Its jaws and teeth differed from those of later stegosaurs, and its skeleton suggests a distinct feeding and defensive style. The existence of Huayangosaurus alongside other Chinese forms shows that early stegosaur evolution was branching, not linear. Several body plans coexisted and competed. The skull matters because stegosaur heads are rare. Their bones were small, lightly built, and easily separated after death. A complete plate can survive transport that destroys a skull. Huayangosaurus preserves enough cranial anatomy to show that early stegosaurs had more variation in head shape than the narrow Stegosaurus model suggests. Jaw depth, tooth arrangement, and beak shape influenced which plants could be cropped and how force moved through the skull. Later stegosaurs generally reduced and elongated the skull. Their teeth remained small, and the neck in most species stayed relatively short. The body behind the head became more specialized for fermentation, armor, and defense. This pattern separates food collection from food processing. A small head lowers the cost of moving the neck and allows selective feeding, while the torso carries the digestive machinery. Sauropods evolved a similar division for different reasons, and at a far larger scale. In a diverse herbivore community, skull shape helps divide resources. Huayangosaurus may have taken somewhat different vegetation from contemporary sauropods or other stegosaurs. Height, bite mechanics, and muzzle width would influence every mouthful. Fossils rarely preserve the plant attached to the teeth, but functional anatomy can define the range of likely options. It cannot identify a favorite food with certainty. The shoulder spikes of early stegosaurs created a defensive zone different from the tail-focused system of Stegosaurus. A lateral spine protected the front half and made it harder for a predator to close beside the chest. Gigant Spinosaurus, a later Chinese stegosaur, carried shoulder spines so large that they dominate reconstructions. Their bony cores extended outward and slightly backward, probably lengthened by keratin. The animal's name refers to these enormous structures. The exact orientation of shoulder spines can be difficult to reconstruct because osteoderms detach and rotate after death. A spike found near the shoulder may have belonged farther along the body. Articulation surfaces, symmetry, associated bones, and comparisons with better specimens help establish position. For Gigantospinosaurus, preserved associations support the presence of truly exceptional parascapular spines. Whether they served mainly defense, display, or both remains open. From the front, those spines would have widened the animal dramatically. A predator attempting to bite the neck or shoulder would face a hard point before reaching the torso. Another stegosaur could also assess the span at a distance. If the spines differed with age or sex, they may have turned body width into a social signal. Their cost was obvious. Moving between trees, lying down, or passing another animal required awareness of structures extending beyond the visible head. Chungkingosaurus from the upper Shaximiao Formation was named from material found near Chongqing. It appears to have been a relatively small stegosaur, though known specimens may include individuals that were not fully grown. Plates and spikes formed a complex series, and the tail may have carried more than the 4 terminal spikes familiar from Stegosaurus. The genus has been debated because some material is incomplete and may overlap with other Chinese stegosaurs. This uncertainty is common in deposits where several related animals coexist. Tuojiangosaurus multispinus is better known and became one of the first Chinese stegosaurs widely displayed in museums. It lived during the late Jurassic and reached a size closer to Stegosaurus, though it retained a different arrangement of armor. Tall, pointed plates ran along the front and middle of the back. Farther behind, the osteoderms became more spike-like. The tail ended in pairs of long spines, and additional lateral spikes may have protected the hips or shoulders, depending on specimen interpretation. Tuojiangosaurus moved through a late Jurassic Chinese ecosystem with sauropods such as Mamenchisaurus and several large theropods. Its environment was humid, crossed by rivers and dotted with lakes. Seasonal variations still mattered, but the plant communities and geography differed from the Morrison Formation. Conifers, cycads, bennettitalians, ferns, and horsetails supplied the same broad categories of food, while species and local abundance changed. Plated dinosaurs were adapting to regional worlds, not occupying one universal Jurassic habitat. The similarity between Tuojiangosaurus and Stegosaurus reflects shared ancestry and similar ecological pressures. Both were large quadrupedal herbivores with small heads, elevated hips, dorsal osteoderms, and armed tails. The differences are equally important. Plate shapes, spike distribution, skull anatomy, and vertebral details show that they belonged to separate branches. Convergence and inheritance can produce bodies that look alike from a distance, while preserving distinct histories in the bones. Phylogenetic analysis turns those details into a family tree. Researchers score anatomical characters across species, the shape of a vertebral process, the proportions of a femur, the presence of a particular opening in the skull, the structure of plates, and many others. Computer algorithms search for trees that explain the distribution of characters with the fewest or most probable evolutionary changes. The result is a hypothesis, not a final diagram. New taxa and rescored characters can rearrange branches. Stegosaurs are difficult because many species are known from partial skeletons and because osteoderms vary along a single body. Missing data can make several tree positions equally plausible. The skull is especially valuable, but often absent. Researchers therefore combine broad datasets and test how stable a relationship remains under different assumptions. A genus that moves repeatedly between branches should be described with more caution than one supported across many analyses. Names can give a false impression of precision. A fossil may be confidently identifiable as a stegosaur, but not as a particular genus. Another may belong to a known genus, but not a named species. Fragmentary remains from a new continent can show that the group was present without revealing its exact relationships. Scientific language such as Stegosauria indeterminate is not failure. It prevents a small bone from carrying more certainty than it can support. In the field, that uncertainty begins with fragments. A rounded piece of bone in red sediment may be part of a plate base. A sharp section could be a spike, rib, or broken limb element. Preparation reveals internal texture and surface pattern. Comparison drawers hold similar fragments from other sites. Sometimes the identity becomes clear only when a matching vertebra or second osteoderm is found meters away. Discovery is often recognition delayed. Chinese stegosaur quarries also reveal how carcasses accumulated. Floods could transport bones into channels. Droughts concentrated animals near shrinking water. Sediment buried remains at different stages of decay. Several individuals in one site do not necessarily prove they lived as a herd. Age profiles, articulation, orientation, and sedimentology must be examined together. A mixed bone bed may represent repeated events over centuries rather than one catastrophe. Yet multiple species in the same formation do indicate ecological complexity, even if they did not all meet on the same day. Similar herbivores can coexist by feeding at different heights, choosing different plants, occupying different soils, or using habitats at different seasons. The armor itself may also reflect habitat. Long lateral spines suit open movement better than dense forest. Broad plates may aid display across clearings. These connections are plausible, but difficult to test because vegetation maps are reconstructed from separate fossil samples. One way forward is dental microwear. Microscopic scratches and pits form as teeth contact food and grit. Their pattern can distinguish broad categories of feeding behavior, though translating modern calibrations to extinct dinosaurs requires care. A low browser taking dusty plants near the ground may show different wear from an animal selecting leaves above the soil. Applying these methods across stegosaur species could reveal whether similar bodies divided the plant community more finely than skeletons suggest. Tooth replacement also affects wear. A tooth near the end of its functional life records more feeding than a newly erupted tooth. Position in the jaw changes contact. Sediment stuck to plants can dominate the signal. Large samples are needed, and stegosaur teeth are small. Their very abundance as isolated fossils may eventually provide data beyond what rare skulls allow. Stable isotopes preserved in tooth enamel can record aspects of water source, diet, and movement. Oxygen isotopes may reflect drinking water and climate. Carbon isotopes can distinguish plant communities under some conditions, though Jurassic gymnosperms do not create the same simple categories used in later grassland studies. Diagenesis, the chemical alteration of fossils after burial, can overwrite original signals. Each tooth must be tested for preservation before its numbers become behavior. The future picture of stegosaur ecology may therefore come from tiny samples rather than spectacular skeletons. A drilled line across enamel. A thin section from a broken plate. Sediment grains between foot bones. Pollen from the surrounding matrix. The grand silhouette draws attention, but the smallest evidence often explains how the animal lived. Early stegosaurs were spreading, while Pangea continued to fragment. Continents were not yet in modern positions. Land connections opened and closed as seas rose, rifts widened, and climates shifted. Populations separated for millions of years, allowing distinctive armor patterns to evolve. At other times, temporary corridors permitted dispersal. The global history of stegosaurs is therefore also a history of geography. Asia held some of the earliest and most diverse Jurassic forms. Europe preserves tracks and bones from Middle and Late Jurassic deposits. Africa contains Kentrosaurus at Tendaguru and more fragmentary stegosaurs in northern regions. North America produced Hesperosaurus and Stegosaurus. South America and Australia have far less certain records. Absence may reflect real biogeography, poor sampling, or both. Terrestrial Jurassic rocks are unevenly exposed across the planet. A map of fossil localities can look like a map of animal distribution, but it is also a map of where sedimentary basins survived and where paleontologists worked. Tropical weathering destroys some rocks. Forest cover hides outcrops. Political borders and funding shape field access. A group may seem concentrated in the northern hemisphere, partly because the southern hemisphere record is incomplete. New discoveries in Morocco and elsewhere have repeatedly shown that armored dinosaur diversity was broader than older datasets suggested. At Tendaguru in Tanzania, the story emerges from a sequence of hills and dry gullies that once lay near a late Jurassic coast. German expeditions in the early 20th century excavated enormous quantities of dinosaur bone there. Sauropods dominated the famous mounts, but among them were hundreds of bones from Kentrosaurus aethiopicus. Multiple individuals allowed researchers to reconstruct most of the skeleton and examine variation across age and size. Kentrosaurus was smaller and lighter than a large Stegosaurus, commonly reconstructed around 4 to 5 meters long, though size estimates vary. Its front half carried relatively small plates. Behind the pelvis, long paired spikes extended along the tail. Additional spines may have projected from the shoulder region. The center of mass lay close to the hips, and the tail formed a large portion of the animal's length. This made Kentrosaurus an ideal subject for digital studies of posture and defense. A predator approaching Kentrosaurus faced more spike points than it would on Stegosaurus. The weaponized region began farther forward, creating a broad moving barrier. Smaller body size may have allowed quicker turning, while the long tail increased reach. Modeling suggests that strikes could generate severe injuries. The animal was not a miniature version of its North American relative. It invested more heavily in spines and less in broad display plates. Tendaguru predators included theropods such as Ceratosaurus-like forms and larger hunters, whose taxonomy remains complex. Exact interactions cannot be assigned from coexistence alone. Yet Kentrosaurus evolved in an ecosystem where large carnivores were present, and the tail anatomy is difficult to explain without defense as a major function. Display may have shaped spine form, but penetration and impact were built into the structure. The coastal plain around Tendaguru changed with tides, rivers, storms, and seasonal rainfall. Channels carried logs and carcasses toward lagoons. Vegetation included conifers, cycads, and ferns. Sauropods browsed at several heights. Kentrosaurus fed below them, moving through open areas where its spikes had room to clear. When the dry season tightened around water, animals gathered and mortality increased. Some bodies were buried, where sediment accumulated fast enough to preserve them. The famous Tendaguru collections were shaped by colonial history. Local workers performed much of the excavation and transport under German direction in what was then German East Africa. Thousands of fossils were moved to Europe. Modern research must acknowledge both the scientific importance of the material and the unequal system through which it was acquired. Fossils are natural evidence, but collections also carry human histories of labor, ownership, and power. Re-examining old field notes can restore some lost context. Sketches record bone positions. Labels preserve quarry numbers. Sediment attached to specimens identifies layers. Digital databases can reunite information separated among institutions. Kentrosaurus research continues not only through new excavation, but through careful recovery of the circumstances surrounding bones collected more than a century ago. The skeletons also show individual variation. Plates differ in outline. Spikes differ in size. Some bones come from juveniles, others adults. Mixing elements from several individuals can create a composite mount that never existed in life. Museums often do this transparently to present a complete animal, using casts and mirrored pieces. Scientific analysis must return to specimen numbers and distinguish which bones belong together. Composite skeletons are valuable for education, but risky as data if their mixed origin is forgotten. A tail from one individual and a pelvis from another may produce proportions outside the normal range. Digital reconstruction allows researchers to scale missing pieces more carefully and test alternatives. The specimen remains incomplete, but the uncertainty becomes visible. Across Africa and Asia, the stegosaur body plan proved adaptable. It could be small or large, plate-heavy or spike-heavy, relatively level-backed or steeply arched. The head remained modest, the torso broad, and the tail important. This shared foundation allowed regional evolution without losing the basic identity of the group. By the late Jurassic, plated dinosaurs were no longer a new experiment. They had already occupied ecosystems for more than 20 million years. Their armor had diversified into signals and weapons recognized across continents. Stegosaurus was one late expression of that success, not its beginning. To understand why its plates became so broad and its tail spikes so concentrated, the wider family must remain in view. Early forms with mixed armor, Chinese species with shoulder spines, African species with long caudal weapons, and European lineages that changed the proportions of the neck itself. Europe produced a different branch of the plated dinosaur story. During the late Jurassic, much of the continent was divided into islands, shallow seas, coastal plains, and low land masses separated by changing waterways. Populations could become isolated, then reconnect when sea level fell or land bridges emerged. This geography encouraged regional evolution while still allowing occasional exchange with North America and Africa. Stegosaur fossils from England, France, Spain, and Portugal record animals related to one another but not identical to the Morrison forms. Dinosaurus armatus was among the first stegosaurs named, originally described in the 19th century from England under the preoccupied name Omosaurus. Its remains include a partial skeleton with robust vertebrae, limb bones, and osteoderms. Later finds from the Iberian Peninsula expanded the picture. Dinosaurus was a large, heavily built stegosaur with a broad pelvis and powerful limbs. The armor sequence is incomplete, but it included plates and long spikes, especially toward the tail. Its proportions suggest an animal less dramatically high-plated than Stegosaurus and more massive through the trunk. European stegosaur taxonomy has been difficult because many fossils are partial and were named at different times under different standards. A vertebra from one country, a plate from another, and a partial skeleton from a third may appear similar without preserving enough overlap for confident identification. Recent studies have returned to original specimens, compared them bone by bone, and revised diagnoses. Some names have been rejected. Others, including Dinosaurus and Miragaia, have gained stronger support through more complete material. Miragaia longicolum was named from Portugal in 2009 and immediately stood apart because of its neck. Most stegosaurs had relatively short necks. Miragaia possessed at least 17 cervical vertebrae, more than many sauropods, creating a long, flexible feeding reach at the front of a plated body. The preserved skeleton was incomplete, and its relationship to Dinosaurus became controversial. A more complete Portuguese specimen described in 2019 supported Miragaia as a valid genus and clarified a group of closely related stegosaurs called Dinosaurans. The long neck changed the animal's feeding envelope without turning it into a sauropod. Miragaia remained far smaller than the giants and carried a heavier head relative to neck length. It could reach vegetation unavailable to a short-necked stegosaur while still feeding below the highest sauropod zones. The extra vertebrae show that stegosaur evolution was not limited to armor. The same basic body could be modified through the skull, neck, limbs, and tail to divide resources in crowded herbivore communities. The visual effect would have been unusual. A small head extended well forward from a long neck. The torso remained broad, the hips elevated, and osteoderms rose along the back. The tail carried defensive structures. From a distance, Miragaia might resemble a compact sauropod until the plates and spikes became clear. Its discoverers called it a sauropod mimic, not because it was closely related, but because two separate herbivore lineages reached a similar solution for expanding feeding reach. Convergence usually remains partial. Sauropod necks were supported by pneumatic vertebrae and a respiratory system that reduced weight. Miragaia did not possess the same extreme air-filled architecture. Its neck length was impressive within Stegosaurs, but modest beside Diplodocus or Mamenchisaurus. Different anatomical foundations set different limits. Evolution can approach the same ecological problem through several routes without producing the same machine. Loricatosaurus, known from material found in France and England, represents another European stegosaur. It was once assigned to Lexovisaurus, a name still common in older books and museum displays. Reassessment showed that the type material of Lexovisaurus was too poor to support the better skeleton, leading to the name Loricatosaurus for the more diagnostic remains. A large spike associated with the specimen was originally placed on the shoulder, though its precise position has been debated. The history illustrates how one isolated osteoderm can shape the public image of an animal for decades. Fossil names are tools for organizing variation. They are not labels revealed automatically by the rock. A genus is proposed when a combination of features distinguishes a group from others. Later discoveries may show that the difference was based on age, deformation, or a bone placed in the wrong position. Revision is therefore part of progress, even when it removes a familiar name. The animal lived once. Human classification changes as evidence improves. The Iberian Peninsula is especially rich in late Jurassic and earliest Cretaceous stegosaur bones and tracks. Formations in Spain and Portugal preserve tidal flats, river channels, lagoons, soils, and coastal floodplains. Deltapodous trackways cross some surfaces. Plates, spikes, vertebrae, and partial skeletons occur in others. In certain regions, the quantity and variety are high enough that researchers have described them as a stegosaur paradise. The phrase reflects sampling as well as ancient abundance, but these deposits clearly held important populations near the Jurassic-Cretaceous transition. A track surface in eastern Spain preserves paths where shallow water once moved across sediment. The prints vary in shape along the same trackway as the animal changes foot posture and the mud changes consistency. Some impressions look almost sauropod-like. Three-dimensional models help separate the crescent-shaped hand and broad, three-toed hind foot of a stegosaur from the deeper, more rounded tracks of a sauropod. The distinction matters because misidentification changes every conclusion about abundance and behavior. Parallel paths on these surfaces may record group movement. Other accumulations share a preferred direction without clear simultaneous travel. Researchers interpret them cautiously, distinguishing strict herding from repeated use of the same route. The smallest tracks are especially important. They show that young stegosaurs entered exposed flats and moved through the same environments as larger animals. Whether adults accompanied them is not always preserved. Portugal provides a possible connection to North America. During the late Jurassic, the young Atlantics separated the regions, but temporary land routes or island chains may have allowed faunal exchange. Stegosaurus-like material occurs in Portugal, and the Decentruran stegosaur Alcovosaurus, or a close relative, appears in the Morrison record, depending on taxonomic interpretation. Similarities among dinosaurs on both sides of the Atlantic suggest that isolation was incomplete. A land bridge did not need to remain open for long. A population crossing over thousands of years could establish descendants that persisted after the route disappeared. Sea level change, tectonic uplift, and island stepping all offer mechanisms. Once separated, the populations evolved independently. This can explain why late Jurassic faunas share broad groups while differing in genera and species. Biogeographic stories are sensitive to family trees. If two species thought to be close relatives move apart in a new analysis, the proposed dispersal route may no longer be necessary. Geological dates also matter. Similar animals separated by 5 million years do not prove a direct corridor at one moment. Researchers combine phylogeny, stratigraphy, and paleogeographic models, then test whether a scenario requires too many unsupported crossings. North Africa has changed the picture further. For a long time, Jurassic armored dinosaurs from Gondwana were poorly known compared with those from Europe, Asia, and North America. In 2020, Adraticlit bulafa was described from the Middle Jurassic of Morocco based on partial bones. It was identified as a stegosaur related to Dacentrurans, making it the first named stegosaur from North Africa. The discovery suggested that the group had reached Gondwana earlier and more broadly than the traditional fossil map implied. Morocco then produced Thyreosaurus atlasicus, described in 2024 from Middle Jurassic deposits. Its name refers to a shield, and the animal preserved remarkable flattened osteoderms with an unusual texture. The skeleton is incomplete, but the armor indicates a distinct stegosaur experiment. Instead of assuming that African stegosaurs copied European forms, the fossils reveal their own combinations, developed in ecosystems that remain only partly sampled. These discoveries also place stegosaurs beside early ankylosaurs in North Africa. Spicamelus, an ankylosaur from roughly the same broad interval, carried armor far more elaborate than expected for such an early member of its group. The coexistence of strange stegosaurs and ankylosaurs shows that armored dinosaur evolution was already producing extremes in the Middle Jurassic. The old model of simple early forms gradually becoming ornate later is no longer sufficient. Thyreosaurus is known from limited material, so its complete outline remains speculative. The flattened osteoderms may have overlapped or formed a distinctive series along the body. Their microscopic structure can help determine orientation and growth. Future finds could alter the reconstruction substantially. Naming the animal creates a hypothesis that new fossils can test, not a finished portrait. South America has an even thinner stegosaur record. For many years, possible material was disputed or re-identified. In 2021, researchers described the first osteological record they considered reliable from the Upper Jurassic of Patagonia. The fossils are fragmentary, but they extend the group's confirmed presence into another part of Gondwana. A single vertebra or osteoderm cannot reveal the full animal, yet it changes the geographic minimum. Continental absence should therefore be phrased carefully. Stegosaurs are not well documented from Australia or Antarctica, and their South American record is sparse. This may reflect ecological limits, but it may also reflect missing rock and limited exposure. The Jurassic terrestrial record of the Southern Hemisphere is patchy. Every new basin can redraw the map. North America, by contrast, preserves enough material to show that Stegosaurus was not the only plated dinosaur in the Morrison. Hesperosaurus manjosi was named from Wyoming material with a skull and partial skeleton. It lived earlier in the formation than many classic Stegosaurus specimens and had lower, more elongated plates. The skull and vertebrae also differed. Some researchers once placed Hesperosaurus inside Stegosaurus, but later analyses commonly retain it as a separate genus. Hesperosaurus is important because it shows turnover within the Morrison. The plated dinosaurs of an earlier interval were not identical to those several million years later. Climate, vegetation, and faunal composition changed while sediment continued accumulating. A single formation name can conceal evolutionary succession. Hesperosaurus, Stegosaurus, and possible Dacentrurans occupied different parts of that long record. The plate dimorphism debate centered on Hesperosaurus material from the Howe Stevens Quarry in Wyoming. Broad and tall plate morphs were interpreted by one study as male and female forms. Critics questioned whether all specimens belonged to one species and whether the sample supported sex assignment. Whatever the outcome, The quarry demonstrates the value of multiple individuals from a constrained site. Population-level questions require more than one beautiful skeleton. A population sample can reveal growth curves, injury frequency, size variation, and common plate shapes. It can show whether juveniles lived with adults and whether deaths occurred in one event. Such sites are rare because burial must concentrate several animals while preserving enough context to distinguish catastrophe from long-term accumulation. When they occur, they shift research from anatomy toward biology. Stegosaurus itself included variation across species and individuals. Stenops had a relatively broad skull and the classic large plates. Ungulatus is often reconstructed as larger, with proportionally different plates and tail anatomy, though complete material is limited. Sulcatus has been proposed as a distinct form based partly on unusual spikes, but its status remains debated. The number of valid species depends on how researchers interpret fragmentary types and overlapping specimens. Popular books often give a fixed list, but taxonomy does not remain fixed. A species may be valid in one analysis and indeterminate in another. The strongest script, therefore, avoids presenting every disputed name as settled. Stegosaurus is secure. Stenops and S. ungulatus are widely recognized. Beyond that, caution increases. Portugal has yielded Stegosaurus material often assigned to S. ungulatus, or a closely related species, indicating a genus-level connection across the Atlantic. The bones are not as complete as the best Morrison skeletons, and European taxonomy continues to be revised. Still, the presence of Stegosaurus-like animals on both sides supports episodic dispersal late in the Jurassic. Picture a coastline broken by islands and shallow channels. A population moves across a broad plain during a low sea stand. Generations later, water returns and separates the descendants. On one side, plate shapes shift. On the other, tail proportions change. The crossing leaves no footprint that can be followed from continent to continent. Its evidence survives in resemblance. The plated dinosaurs were therefore neither globally uniform nor narrowly local. They spread widely but diversified regionally. Their armor acted like a visible signature of isolation. A shoulder spine in China, a long neck in Portugal, a spike-heavy tail in Tanzania, and tall plates in North America all emerged from the same basic developmental inheritance. This diversity reached its clearest expression during the late Jurassic. By then, stegosaurs occupied several continents and multiple feeding niches. Some were modest in size. Others approached the mass of elephants. Plate surface area, spike length, neck reach, and skull shape varied enough to affect ecology. The group had passed far beyond its small armored beginnings. Then, the record thins. Early Cretaceous rocks still contain stegosaurs, tracks, and named genera, especially in Asia and Europe, but their diversity appears lower. Ankylosaurs become more common and more varied. Ornithopods develop increasingly effective jaws and, in some lineages, social systems that supported large populations. Flowering plants begin their rise. Continents separate further. No single change explains the decline. The last chapter of the plated dinosaurs is therefore not a sudden extinction scene. It is a gradual narrowing of a once broad experiment. Species survive in particular regions while disappearing from others. Tracks continue after familiar Jurassic genera are gone. Fragmentary bones extend the timeline. New discoveries push the final record younger, reminding us that extinction is only as precise as the rocks that preserve it. The early Cretaceous began around 145 million years ago, but no animal experienced a boundary. River systems continued, coastlines shifted, and generations of stegosaurs lived through changes too gradual to notice within a lifetime. Some Jurassic lineages crossed into the new period. Their fossils occur in rocks of Europe, Asia, and Africa, often as partial skeletons, isolated plates, or footprints. The record is thinner, yet it is not empty. Plated dinosaurs remained part of terrestrial ecosystems for tens of millions of years after Stegosaurus disappeared. Wurhosaurus is the best-known early Cretaceous stegosaur from China. It lived in what is now Xinjiang and is represented by incomplete material, including vertebrae, limb bones, and broad, low osteoderms. Older reconstructions gave it unusually flattened plates, almost rectangular in outline. Some of that shape may reflect breakage, and a complete armor sequence is unknown. The animal was still unmistakably stegosaurian, a large quadrupedal herbivore with a small head, heavy body, and defensive tail. Its environment differed from the Morrison. Northern Chinese basins held rivers, lakes, open woodland, and seasonal conditions shaped by changing continental geography. Early birds and feathered theropods were diversifying across Asia. Ornithopods were becoming more prominent. Ankylosaurs shared parts of the landscape. Wurhosaurus occupied a world in which the old plated design still worked, but the community around it was changing. Peranthodon africanus, from the early Cretaceous Kirkwood Formation of South Africa, is known mainly from a partial skull and teeth. Its identification has moved through several groups since the 19th century because the material is limited. Modern analyses generally support a stegosaurian position, though its exact relationships remain unstable. The fossil is valuable precisely because cranial remains are rare and because it places a plated dinosaur in southern Africa after the Jurassic. Other reported Cretaceous stegosaurs are more uncertain. Fragmentary bones from Europe, Mongolia, India, and elsewhere have been assigned to the group with varying confidence. Some names rest on material that cannot be distinguished securely from ankylosaurs or other ornithischians. A late survival claim must therefore be tested against anatomy and geological age. One misidentified osteoderm can extend a lineage by millions of years on paper. Tracks provide independent support. Deltapetus-like footprints occur in early Cretaceous deposits, showing that stegosaur-shaped feet crossed mud even where body fossils are absent. The trackmaker cannot usually be named, but the path confirms presence. Such evidence is especially important near the end of a group's range, when populations may be geographically restricted and skeletons rare. In 2024, Yanbeilong ultimus was described from Albian-age rocks of Shaanxi province in China. It is known from partial postcranial material rather than a complete skeleton, but its anatomy supports a stegosaur identity. The species name, meaning last, reflects its young geological age. It lived roughly 100 million years ago, making it one of the latest named stegosaurs and showing that the group persisted later in Asia than older summaries often suggested. Yanbeilong does not prove that stegosaurs were common at that time. Rarity in the fossil record may reflect low abundance, limited habitat, or poor sampling. Still, it changes the final chapter. The group did not simply fade at the beginning of the Cretaceous. Isolated lineages survived deep into the period, alongside increasingly diverse ankylosaurs, ornithopods, sauropods, and theropods. Why stegosaurs declined remains unresolved because several explanations overlap. Ankylosaurs may have competed for some low-browsing resources and defensive niches. Ornithopods evolved more complex chewing systems and could process plants efficiently. Flowering plants began to diversify, altering vegetation over long intervals. Continents fragmented, climates changed, and regional extinctions removed populations. None of these factors alone produces a clear global cause. Competition is often described too simply. Two herbivores do not compete merely because they both eat plants. They must overlap in food, height, habitat, season, and geography. Ankylosaurs and stegosaurs could coexist, and they did in several ecosystems. Ankylosaurs generally carried broader body armor, and in later forms, tail clubs. Stegosaurs emphasized vertical plates and spikes. The success of one did not automatically require the extinction of the other. Flowering plants also did not replace Jurassic vegetation overnight. Conifers, cycads, ferns, and horsetails remained abundant through the Cretaceous. Early angiosperms were initially small components of many ecosystems and diversified unevenly. A stegosaur capable of flexible low browsing was not necessarily unable to feed in a flowering plant world. Plant change may have altered communities indirectly, favoring other herbivores or changing disturbance patterns, but the mechanism remains difficult to isolate. Body design can create long-term constraints. Stegosaurs invested in a small head, broad fermenting torso, and expensive osteoderms. This combination had succeeded for more than 60 million years. As ecosystems changed, lineages with faster feeding, more efficient oral processing, different social behavior, or denser armor may have expanded into available roles. A successful specialization can become less competitive without ever becoming poorly adapted in an absolute sense. Extinction is not a judgment on design. The last stegosaurs were not inferior versions of ankylosaurs. They were survivors of an old radiation occupying shrinking geographic and ecological space. A drought, volcanic episode, habitat shift, or sequence of local disruptions can remove a small population even when every individual is well suited to normal conditions. Once numbers fall and ranges contract, chance becomes more powerful. The final disappearance is difficult to date exactly. Fossil lineages have what paleontologists call the Senior-Lips effect. The last known fossil usually predates the true extinction because preservation is incomplete. If a species becomes rare, the chance of finding its final individuals falls sharply. Yanbeilong and other late records may still lie millions of years before the actual last stegosaur. Somewhere, a younger bone may remain inside unexposed rock. By the late Cretaceous, ankylosaurs had taken armored dinosaur anatomy in another direction. Nodosaurids carried extensive body armor and shoulder spines. Ankylosaurids developed widened skulls, fused armor, and in many species a tail club built from stiffened vertebrae and enlarged terminal osteoderms. Their low, broad bodies were defensive platforms, but their armor covered more of the torso than stegosaur plates ever had. The comparison clarifies Stegosaurus. Its protection was not a primitive attempt at ankylosaur armor. It emphasized warning, visibility, and a penetrating tail weapon rather than continuous coverage and blunt impact. Both strategies grew from osteoderms, yet they solved danger differently. One lineage raised bone into tall plates. The other spread bone across the body and, later, concentrated mass into a club. Recent discoveries have made the early history of ankylosaurs as surprising as that of stegosaurs. Middle Jurassic Spicamelus from Morocco carried extreme spikes and evidence of a specialized tail long before such complexity was expected. This shows that armored dinosaur evolution did not proceed from simple beginnings towards steadily greater ornament. Elaborate structures appeared early, disappeared, and reappeared in new forms. The fossil record samples a branching experiment, not a planned progression. Stegosaurs left no living descendants. Birds are theropod dinosaurs, not ornithischians, and the plated lineage ended completely. Crocodilians grow osteoderms, and mammals evolved quills, horns, antlers, and armor, but none inherited the Stegosaurus plate sequence. The shape survives only in fossils and in the human images built from them. Those images have changed repeatedly. 19th century Stegosaurus was low, sprawling, and roofed with flat plates. Early 20th century versions dragged the tail. Mid-century reconstructions often emphasized sluggishness and a nearly useless brain. Modern mounts raise the tail, place the limbs beneath the body, stagger the plates, and restore a more active posture. Each generation believes it has corrected the last, and each will probably be corrected again. A reconstruction is strongest when it shows confidence unevenly. The number and sequence of bones may be well supported. Muscle volume has a plausible range. Skin texture is less certain. Color is unknown. Social display is possible. A specific courtship dance is invention. Separating these levels does not make paleoart less vivid. It allows the animal to be vivid without pretending that imagination is evidence. Exceptional specimens continue to narrow uncertainty. Sophie in London provides a nearly complete skeleton and skull. Other important individuals in American and European collections preserve different ages and plate sequences. The specimen known as Apex, placed on display at the American Museum of Natural History, adds another unusually complete adult-scale skeleton to current study. Scans, histology, and comparisons across these animals can test variation that once depended on isolated bones. Completeness is not the same as perfection. A skeleton may be crushed, distorted, or missing soft tissues. Plates can shift. Bones can be repaired with plaster. Commercial preparation may obscure quarry context. Researchers document every element, identify restoration, and separate original fossil from cast. The most beautiful mount still needs a specimen map and a preparation history. New methods extract data without destroying rare bones. Computed tomography reveals internal cavities and hidden fractures. Photogrammetry creates shareable three-dimensional models. Finite element analysis estimates stress in teeth and spikes. Histology samples microscopic tissue, usually from damaged areas or small cores. Geochemical methods test diet and environment. Track scanning preserves surfaces that weather after exposure. The techniques are modern, but the questions remain physical. How much force could the jaw produce? How quickly did a plate grow? Where did the foot press hardest? How far could the tail swing before joints reached their limit? What plants grew in the same soil? The living animal is approached through measurable constraints. Museum visitors often begin with the plates because the eye has nowhere else to go. The skull can be missed beneath them. The small teeth are hidden. The hand bones seem insignificant. Yet those quiet parts explain most of the day. The plates made Stegosaurus recognizable. The mouth, feet, lungs, gut, and senses made it alive. A complete life included seasons the skeleton cannot display. Rain struck the plates and ran down the flanks. Dust collected in folds of skin. Insects landed on wounds. Sun warmed one side of the body. Old keratin wore from the beak and spikes while new material grew beneath. The animal breathed through thousands of ordinary moments, each dependent on tissues now absent. It also lived among plants that transformed the atmosphere and soil around it. Ferns colonized fresh sediment after floods. Conifer roots stabilized banks. Dead leaves fed fungi and invertebrates. Sauropods opened paths. Predators redistributed carcasses. Stegosaurus was neither isolated centerpiece nor background decoration. It was one participant in an ecosystem whose smallest organisms made the giants possible. The Morrison Formation preserves that network unevenly. Large bones dominate museums because they are visible and durable. Pollen, spores, fish scales, turtle fragments, small teeth, insect traces, freshwater shells, and soil horizons fill in the environment. A Stegosaurus skeleton without those details is anatomy. With them, it becomes an animal standing somewhere. Somewhere was a floodplain beneath a warmer sky, east of mountains rising in the west. The Atlantic was young. There was no grass beneath the feet and no flowering canopy overhead. The continents carried familiar outlines only in fragments, yet the day still had heat, wind, cloud, hunger, risk, and rest. Deep time changes the actors more than it changes the basic pressures of being alive. A Stegosaurus at the river edge lowers its head. The beak closes on new growth. Its hind feet remain on firmer ground, while the forefeet sink slightly into mud. One plate bears an old injury near the edge. The tail points away from the water, leaving room to swing. Nothing attacks. The animal feeds and moves on. Hours later, rain begins upstream. The river rises across the channel and erases the footprints. Leaves collect against branches. Sediment settles in the deeper impressions before they disappear. Most traces are lost. One patch of mud is buried quickly enough to survive. millions of years pass without a single event at that spot that would matter to the animal. The river becomes rock. Continents move. The overlying layers thicken, fracture, and erode. The track surface approaches daylight. A slab breaks along the ancient boundary and exposes the shape of a foot. The plate in the quarry wall follows the same long route. Bone becomes mineral while pressure builds above it. Water moves through pores and changes its chemistry. Mountains rise, and erosion removes the layers that once buried the carcass. At last, a dark curve appears in pale stone. A brush clears the surface. The plate is measured, mapped, lifted, and studied. It can tell us that blood once moved through channels. It can show where growth slowed, where tissue remodeled, and how its shape compared with plates from other individuals. It can support ideas about display, heat exchange, or species identity. It cannot recover the color or the exact signal seen by another Stegosaurus across a floodplain. The limit remains, but it is not emptiness. Around that limit stand the skeleton, the trackway, the injured predator bone, the worn tooth, the juvenile femur, the pollen grain, and the ancient soil. Each piece is incomplete. Their agreement is what makes the world visible. The plated dinosaurs are gone, and no modern animal repeats their arrangement. Nothing alive carries a staggered line of meter-high osteoderms above a low-browsing head and a four-spiked tail. The silhouette belongs to one interval of Earth history, produced by evolution and then removed from it. The scientific image will continue to change. A new skull may revise the shape of the beak. A juvenile skeleton may show when the plates first accelerated in growth. A trackway may reveal a tighter turn or a group moving together. A chemical signature may identify the water an individual drank. None of these discoveries will restore the animal completely, but each will reduce the space occupied by guesswork and sharpen the difference between Stegosaurus as an icon and Stegosaurus as a living dinosaur. What remains most certain is also the most physical. It had weight, its feet pressed into ground, its jaws cut plants, its plates grew from blood-fed tissue, and its tail spikes could wound bone. It shared rivers and droughts with other dinosaurs, survived injuries, and eventually died in a place where sediment happened to reach it before destruction did. The extraordinary outline began with ordinary biological demands, repeated through one life and through thousands of generations. In the museum, the plate stands upright under steady light. Its shadow falls across the ribs below, close to the place where skin once held it. Beyond the glass, people move past in minutes. The bone does not move. It has already crossed a distance in time that no journey can match, carrying the shape of an animal that once lowered its head beside a Jurassic river and left the rest to stone.